Invisible wars, the hidden cyber conflicts no one admits are happening. Right now, as you're watching this, there are invisible soldiers inside the networks that power your life. They're not there to steal your data quickly and disappear into the night. They're not there to launch a flashy ransomware attack that makes headlines. They're there to wait, to watch, to learn, to map every digital corridor, every password, every vulnerable point in systems that keep your water running, your lights on, your communications flowing. They've been there for years. In some cases, they've been there for half a decade or more, moving through servers and routers with the patience of ghosts, using your own tools against you, blending into the digital background noise so perfectly that even when defenders find traces of their presence, they can't be certain they've found everything. This is the reality of modern cyber conflict, and it looks nothing like what we imagine warfare to be. There are no decisive battles, no peace treaties, no clear moments of victory or defeat. There's just an endless, silent campaign of infiltration and counterinfiltration, a game of three-dimensional chess played across fiber optic cables and satellite links, where the stakes are measured in the potential to shut down cities, reroute communications, or manipulate the very infrastructure that civilization depends upon. The terrifying part isn't what these invisible armies have done. It's what they're positioned to do. It's the waiting. The conflicts I'm about to describe aren't hypothetical. They're not war games or simulations. They're happening right now, documented by government agencies, confirmed by cybersecurity firms, and largely ignored by a public that has grown numb to the constant drumbeat of data breach notifications. But these aren't data breaches in any traditional sense. These are strategic military operations carried out in peacetime, positioning moves on a global chessboard where the game never ends and nobody keeps score, because admitting you're losing would be admitting vulnerability on a scale that could reshape geopolitical power. What makes these conflicts so insidious, so different from any form of warfare humanity has ever known, is their ambiguity. When a foreign military establishes a forward operating base in your territory, you know it. When they position artillery within striking distance of your cities, you see it. But when they position themselves inside the control systems for your electrical grid, inside the servers managing your water treatment facilities, inside the telecommunications infrastructure that carries your most sensitive government communications, the presence is invisible. The threat is theoretical until the moment it becomes devastatingly real. And by then, it's already too late. These aren't isolated incidents carried out by rogue hackers or criminal syndicates. These are coordinated, well-funded, patient operations conducted by nation-states with clear strategic objectives. They're carried out by units with code names like Volt Typhoon, Salt Typhoon, Sandworm, APT-28, and Lazarus, groups backed by the intelligence services and military commands of China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran. Each has its own methods, its own targets, its own strategic goals, but they all share one thing in common. They're playing a long game that most people don't even know is being played. The United States government, along with its Five Eyes intelligence partners, has been remarkably candid about the scale of this problem, at least in the abstract. The FBI director has called certain aspects of this threat the defining challenge of our generation. The National Security Agency has warned that adversaries are positioning themselves for potential conflicts that haven't happened yet, establishing footholds they can activate at a moment's notice. The Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency issues advisory after advisory about persistent threats to critical sectors. Yet despite this official acknowledgement, despite the warnings from the highest levels of government and intelligence, the response remains constrained by a fundamental paradox. How do you fight a war that everyone pretends isn't happening? Because that's what this is. It's a war, not a Cold War, because there's nothing cold about the constant probing, the relentless exploitation, the daily theft of intellectual property and strategic intelligence. Not a hot war, because there are no kinetic weapons, no casualties in the traditional sense, no burning buildings or destroyed infrastructure, at least not yet. It's something new, something our vocabulary and our international frameworks haven't quite caught up with. It's a war fought in the spaces between ones and zeros, where the weapons are zero-day exploits and legitimate system tools turned against their intended purposes, where the battlefield is everywhere computers connect to networks, which is to say, everywhere. The companies and organizations that have been compromised often can't admit it publicly without triggering panic, tanking stock prices, or revealing the extent of their vulnerability to additional attacks. The government agencies tasked with defense can't always reveal what they know without compromising intelligence sources or methods. And the attackers, operating from the safety of foreign soil, protected by governments that either direct their operations or tacitly approve them, face virtually no consequences for actions that, in any other context, would be considered acts of war. So the conflict continues, day after day, year after year, an open secret that everyone in the cybersecurity community knows about, but that rarely penetrates into broader public consciousness in any meaningful way. What I'm going to show you over the course of this investigation is the reality behind the abstractions. I'm going to take you inside these campaigns, show you how they work, who's carrying them out, what they're after, and why this invisible war is likely to continue indefinitely, a permanent feature of life in a digitally connected world. I'll show you the Chinese groups that have been lurking inside critical infrastructure for years, positioning themselves for conflicts that may or may not come. I'll show you the Russian operations that blur the line between state-sponsored espionage and organized crime. I'll show you the North Korean hackers funding their country's nuclear program one cryptocurrency heist at a time. I'll show you the Iranian operations that combine cyber intrusions with physical attacks in ways that erase the traditional boundaries between digital and kinetic warfare. But more than that, I want to show you why these operations are so difficult to counter, why even when defenders find intruders, they can never be completely certain they've removed them, and why the fundamental architecture of our connected world gives attackers advantages that may be impossible to fully overcome. This isn't a story about good guys winning and bad guys losing. There are no victories here, only varying degrees of compromise, varying levels of awareness about just how thoroughly our networks have been penetrated. The data I'm drawing from comes from hundreds of hours of research, analyzing reports from government agencies like CISA, the FBI, and the NSA, examining technical advisories from cybersecurity firms like Microsoft, CrowdStrike, and Mandiant, reviewing congressional testimony and international intelligence assessments. The picture that emerges is both more complex and more disturbing than any simple narrative about cyber attacks would suggest. Because these aren't attacks in the way we typically use that word. Attacks have beginnings and endings. What we're dealing with is more like occupations. Persistent, patient, strategic occupations of digital territory, conducted with a level of sophistication that makes detection extraordinarily difficult and complete removal potentially impossible. So let's pull back the curtain on the invisible war. Let's look at the soldiers who fight it, the weapons they use, the objectives they pursue, and the battlefields they've turned into permanent operational environments. Let's examine why this conflict continues without resolution, why traditional deterrence doesn't work in cyberspace, and why the networks you depend on every single day are almost certainly hosting uninvited guests who are there for the long haul, watching, waiting, and preparing for possibilities that nobody wants to think about too carefully. This is the story of the wars nobody admits are happening, the conflicts without victories, the occupations without end. Welcome to the invisible battlefield. To understand how we arrived at this strange new paradigm of permanent digital conflict, you need to understand how fundamentally cyberspace has altered the nature of strategic competition between nations. In traditional warfare, you build up forces, you move them into position, you execute operations, and eventually, through some combination of military success and diplomatic negotiation, you reach a resolution. Wars end. They may end in victory or defeat, in negotiated settlements or uneasy truces, but they end. The occupation of territory is visible. The deployment of forces is detectable. Intelligence agencies can count tanks and troops, monitor naval movements, observe air deployments. There are physical signatures that can be tracked, verified, and responded to through established diplomatic and military channels. Cyberspace eliminated almost all of those traditional markers. When a nation-state cyber operation establishes presence inside a foreign network, there are no troops to count, no equipment to photograph from satellites, no supply chains that can be monitored. The occupation is invisible not just to the public, but often to the defenders themselves. An adversary can establish and maintain access to critical systems for years without anyone knowing they're there. And even when their presence is discovered, the nature of digital systems makes complete removal extraordinarily difficult to verify. How do you prove a negative? How do you demonstrate with absolute certainty that no traces of an intrusion remain when an advanced persistent threat group has had months or years to establish backup access methods, alternate entry points, and dormant capabilities hidden in the vast complexity of modern networks? This fundamental shift has created a new strategic environment where the line between peace and conflict has become almost meaninglessly blurred. Nations that maintain perfectly cordial diplomatic relations on the surface are simultaneously conducting aggressive cyber operations against each other's critical infrastructure. The United States and China engage in high-level diplomatic meetings while Chinese cyber units maintain persistent access to American telecommunications networks and industrial control systems. Russia participates in international forums while its military intelligence units conduct ongoing operations against European infrastructure. North Korea maintains a diplomatic presence, however limited, while its hacking groups steal billions in cryptocurrency to fund weapons programs. Iran negotiates nuclear agreements while its cyber forces probe Western critical infrastructure for vulnerabilities. None of this is happening in secret, exactly. Government agencies acknowledge it in advisory after advisory. Cybersecurity firms document it in threat reports and incident analyses. Intelligence officials testify about it before Congress. But it happens in a kind of twilight zone where everyone knows what's occurring, but nobody can quite figure out how to respond in ways that would actually change the fundamental dynamic. Traditional deterrence theory, developed during the Cold War to prevent nuclear conflict, doesn't translate well to cyber operations. The attribution problem, while not as insurmountable as it once was, still provides enough plausible deniability that nations can conduct aggressive cyber operations while maintaining diplomatic deniability. The threshold for what constitutes an act of war in cyberspace remains undefined in international law. And the benefits of conducting these operations, the intelligence gathered, the strategic positioning achieved, the economic value stolen, far outweigh the minimal consequences nations face when caught. What emerged from this situation is what we're witnessing today. A permanent state of low-intensity cyber conflict where adversaries continuously probe each other's networks, establish persistent access, steal intellectual property and strategic intelligence, and position themselves for potential future escalation. It's warfare, but warfare stretched out over years and decades, conducted by operators who measure success not in territory captured or enemies defeated, but in access maintained, intelligence gathered, and positioning achieved. It's a game where the objective isn't to win, but to never lose your foothold, to always maintain the ability to observe, to collect, and potentially to disrupt if the strategic situation changes. The economics of this new form of conflict heavily favor the attackers. Developing offensive cyber capabilities is relatively cheap compared to traditional military hardware. A nation doesn't need aircraft carriers or tank divisions to conduct sophisticated cyber operations. It needs skilled programmers, intelligence analysts, and the infrastructure to support them. North Korea, one of the poorest nations on Earth, has developed cyber capabilities sophisticated enough to steal over $6 billion in cryptocurrency since 2017, according to blockchain analysis firms. That's a return on investment that no conventional military campaign could ever achieve. For a fraction of the cost of a single fighter jet, a nation can maintain cyber units that operate continuously, generating intelligence value and strategic positioning that compounds over time. Defense, meanwhile, is extraordinarily expensive and never fully effective. Organizations must defend every potential entry point, patch every vulnerability, monitor every anomaly, and maintain constant vigilance across networks that grow more complex every year. The defender has to be right every single time. The attacker only has to be right once to gain initial access, and once inside, advanced groups can often maintain presence even in the face of robust defenses. The asymmetry is brutal and probably permanent. As long as systems are complex and humans are involved in maintaining them, there will be vulnerabilities to exploit and mistakes to leverage. This asymmetry has led to a situation where persistent compromise has become almost normalized. Major telecommunications companies acknowledge they were breached by Salt Typhoon, claim to have contained the intrusion, but U.S. government officials continue to state that the threat actors remain active in American networks. Who's telling the truth? Probably both. The companies may have found and removed specific malware or backdoors, but the attackers, having already mapped the networks extensively, can likely re-establish access through other means if they haven't already done so. The complexity of modern telecommunications infrastructure, built up over decades through mergers and acquisitions, incorporating legacy systems alongside modern equipment, provides so many potential entry points and persistence mechanisms that declaring a network completely clean becomes almost meaningless. Or consider the case of Volt Typhoon. The Chinese operation that U.S. agencies assess has been inside critical infrastructure networks for at least 5 years. When the FBI conducted a court-authorized operation to remove malware from compromised routers, did that end the campaign? No. It disrupted specific access points, but the underlying vulnerability of the systems targeted, the techniques used to maintain access, and the strategic imperative driving the operation all remain. The adversary simply adapts, finds new vulnerable devices, establishes new entry points, and continues the campaign through different means. This is why agencies describe these threats as persistent. It's not just that individual intrusions last a long time. It's that the campaigns themselves are ongoing, adapting to defenses, evolving techniques, and maintaining strategic focus over years. The waiting game is central to understanding these operations. Unlike ransomware attacks or data theft for immediate financial gain, many of these nation-state operations are about positioning for potential future needs. Volt Typhoon's presence in water systems and electrical grids isn't about stealing data. Those systems don't typically contain valuable intellectual property. The presence is about establishing the capability to disrupt those systems if geopolitical tensions escalate into actual conflict. It's about creating strategic options. If a conflict erupts over Taiwan, for instance, the ability to disrupt water supplies or power grids in Guam or the continental United States could complicate America's military response, slow mobilization, or simply impose costs that affect strategic calculations. This kind of prepositioning blurs the traditional distinction between peacetime and wartime operations. The intrusion happens in peacetime. The malicious effects, if they ever materialize, would occur during a conflict. But the preparation phase can last for years, with operators maintaining access, updating their knowledge of target networks, adapting to defensive measures, and ensuring they retain capabilities even as systems are upgraded or replaced. It's the ultimate long game, and it requires a level of patience and strategic discipline that's difficult for democratic societies, with their election cycles and shifting priorities, to match consistently. The proliferation of these operations has created a threat landscape where multiple adversaries are often present in the same network simultaneously, sometimes without even knowing about each other. A telecommunications provider might be simultaneously compromised by Chinese espionage operations, Russian intelligence collection, and North Korean operations looking for cryptocurrency-related targets. Each group uses different techniques, maintains separate infrastructure, and pursues different objectives, creating a complex environment where attribution can be challenging and where defensive efforts against one group don't necessarily affect the others. This crowded battlefield has led to some unintentionally revealing moments. Researchers have documented cases where one nation-state group's malware was discovered because it conflicted with another group's tools on the same compromised system. Russian actors have been observed hijacking infrastructure previously compromised by Pakistani groups, using those systems to access their own targets. Chinese groups maintain such extensive access across so many networks that they occasionally appear in incident reports for systems they weren't even targeting, simply because they happen to have access to networks that were part of someone else's attack chain. What all of this adds up to is a fundamental transformation in how strategic competition between nations is conducted. The battlefield expanded to include every network, every connected device, every system with an internet connection. The timeline expanded from the hours or days of traditional military operations to months and years of persistent operations. The concept of victory transformed from something decisive and achievable to something much more ambiguous, measured in access maintained rather than objectives achieved. And the conflict itself became something that occurs continuously, without declarations, without ceasefires, without the possibility of a peace treaty or final resolution. This is the world we live in now. The question isn't whether your networks are being targeted. They almost certainly are. The question is whether the targeting has been successful, whether adversaries have gained persistent access, and whether you have the visibility and capabilities to even know if they're there. For most organizations, the honest answer to that last question is no. They hope they're not compromised. They implement security measures and monitor their networks. But they can't know with certainty, and that uncertainty is exactly what makes these invisible wars so effective. The watchers are there. They're waiting. And because nobody can admit the full extent of the problem without triggering consequences that might be worse than the problem itself, the waiting continues. The game goes on. The invisible war expands. And we all live with ghosts in the machine, whether we know it or not. When Microsoft's threat intelligence team first publicly identified the actor they named Volt Typhoon in May 2023, they were documenting something that had already been going on for years. This wasn't a new group emerging onto the scene. This was a long-running operation that had simply flown under the radar long enough that its discovery warranted public disclosure. What made the revelation particularly disturbing wasn't just the sophistication of the techniques or the sensitivity of the targets. It was the strategic objective behind the operation, which appeared to have nothing to do with traditional cyber espionage and everything to do with prepositioning for potential future conflict. The scope of what Volt Typhoon achieved is staggering when you really sit with it. U.S. government agencies, in a joint advisory that carried the weight of the FBI, NSA, and CISA, confirmed that these actors, assessed to be working on behalf of the People's Republic of China, had compromised the IT environments of multiple critical infrastructure organizations, primarily in communications, energy, transportation systems, and water and wastewater sectors. This wasn't just in the continental United States. It included territories like Guam, that crucial Pacific staging ground for American military power projection. And the intrusions weren't opportunistic smash-and-grab operations. Some of the footholds had been maintained for at least 5 years. 5 years of undetected presence inside systems that control fundamental aspects of how modern society functions. Think about what 5 years means in operational terms. That's enough time to map entire networks, document every upgrade, understand how organizations respond to security incidents, catalog the personalities and schedules of IT staff, identify every critical system and its role in the broader infrastructure, and establish multiple redundant access methods so that if one gets discovered and removed, others remain available. That's not intrusion. That's occupation. It's the digital equivalent of foreign military forces establishing permanent forward operating bases in your territory. Except nobody can see them. Nobody knows exactly how many there are, and removing them completely is somewhere between extraordinarily difficult and effectively impossible. What makes Volt Typhoon particularly sophisticated and particularly difficult to detect and remove is their use of what cybersecurity professionals call living off the land techniques. Rather than deploying custom malware that might trigger antivirus systems or leave distinctive signatures that analysts could track, Volt Typhoon operators extensively use legitimate system tools that exist on every Windows network. PowerShell, Windows management instrumentation, the command line utilities that system administrators use every day to manage networks and troubleshoot problems. When you use legitimate tools for malicious purposes, you blend into the normal background noise of network activity. Unless defenders are specifically looking for unusual patterns in how those tools are being used, the malicious activity looks identical to routine administrative work. This approach requires deep knowledge of the target environment and careful operational discipline. The attackers need to understand how the legitimate tools are typically used in the organization so they can mimic that usage pattern. They need to avoid triggering alerting thresholds or creating anomalies that might draw attention. They need to use the same tools at similar times in ways that fit the expected pattern of administrative activity. It's painstaking, methodical work, and it produces intrusions that can persist for years without detection because they don't look like intrusions. They look like someone managing the network because they're using exactly the same tools and techniques that network management requires. The FBI's director, Christopher Wray, testified before Congress that Volt Typhoon represented China's preparation to wreak havoc and cause real-world harm to American citizens and communities in the event of a conflict, particularly one that might occur over Taiwan. This is a remarkably blunt assessment from a typically circumspect agency. The FBI doesn't usually characterize cyber intrusions in such stark terms unless the intelligence supporting that assessment is overwhelming. What they were saying, in effect, is that the Chinese government has been positioning cyber capabilities inside American critical infrastructure not primarily to steal information, but to create the option to disrupt or destroy that infrastructure if strategic circumstances require it. Consider what that means for a place like Guam. It's approximately 1,800 miles from Taiwan, making it a crucial logistics and staging point for any U.S. military response to a conflict in that region. The massive Andersen Air Force Base sits on the island's northern end. Naval facilities support submarine operations and surface vessels. It's a linchpin in American Pacific military strategy. Now imagine, in the opening hours of a potential conflict, that the electrical grid serving those military facilities becomes unstable. Water treatment systems malfunction. Telecommunications go down. Port management systems freeze. None of it catastrophic in isolation, but collectively enough to slow mobilization, complicate logistics, and degrade the coordinated response that modern military operations require. That's what prepositioning in critical infrastructure enables. Not necessarily spectacular destruction, but strategic degradation of capabilities at the moment when they're most crucial. The pattern of behavior that analysts observed from Volt Typhoon supports this assessment of their objectives. Their reconnaissance before intrusion is extensive, far more thorough than what espionage operations typically require. They learn network architectures in detail, understand how operational technology systems connect to IT networks, identify paths that could provide access from internet-facing systems to the industrial control systems that actually run physical processes. They interact with those OT systems in ways that suggest they're understanding how to manipulate them, not just stealing data from them. In one case documented by CISA, Volt Typhoon actors accessed a vCenter server that was adjacent to operational technology assets, including water treatment plants, water wells, and electrical substations. They enumerated existing PuTTY sessions, which would give them the configuration details needed to access those critical systems directly. The technical methods Volt Typhoon employs demonstrate the effectiveness of patient, methodical approaches over flashy, high-tech exploits. They gain initial access by exploiting vulnerabilities in internet-facing network appliances like VPNs and firewalls, the kind of devices that sit at the edge of networks mediating connections between the internal network and the internet. These devices are attractive targets because they're exposed by necessity. They often run outdated firmware because organizations struggle to patch them without causing outages, and successful compromise gives immediate access to the internal network. Once inside, the operators don't rush. They take time to understand the environment, identify valid accounts they can abuse, steal credentials that let them blend in as legitimate users, and move laterally through the network using the same administrative protocols that IT staff use. Their operational security is exceptional. They use compromised small office and home office routers, the kind of consumer-grade equipment that sits in countless homes and small businesses, as a proxy network to obscure the true source of their activities. Traffic that appears to come from US IP addresses is much less likely to trigger alerts than traffic obviously originating from China. This technique also makes attribution harder, because investigators have to trace back through layers of compromised infrastructure to identify the actual operators. And because these SOHO devices are frequently end-of-life equipment no longer receiving security updates, they're relatively easy to compromise and maintain as persistent proxy infrastructure. The FBI disrupted one of these botnets in a court-authorized operation in early 2024, remotely removing the malware from hundreds of routers. It was a significant operation, requiring a federal court to authorize law enforcement to access private property, the routers belonging to homes and small businesses, without the owner's knowledge or consent. The legal framework for this was carefully constructed, arguing that the owners of these devices were victims of the compromise, not targets of the investigation, and that the public interest in disrupting this infrastructure justified the unusual measure. But while the operation disrupted that specific botnet, it didn't end the campaign. The underlying vulnerability of SOHO devices remains. The strategic imperative driving Chinese operations hasn't changed, and Volt Typhoon or its successor operations undoubtedly adapted, identifying new infrastructure to compromise and new methods to obscure their activities. What's particularly insidious about this kind of positioning is its ambiguity. Having access to industrial control systems doesn't necessarily mean the attackers have developed the specific tools and knowledge required to cause physical destruction or disruption. Establishing that capability requires understanding the specific systems in use, the safety mechanisms in place, the operational parameters that, if exceeded, could cause damage or shutdowns. It's not impossible. The 2015 attack on Ukraine's power grid demonstrated that cyber operations can cause real-world physical effects, shutting down substations and leaving hundreds of thousands of people without power in winter. But it requires more than just network access. It requires the kind of deep understanding and careful development that takes time. So the question with Volt Typhoon and similar operations is whether the positioning is complete, whether the capabilities have been fully developed, or whether what's been discovered so far is the early stage of a longer campaign still in progress. The agency's warning about this threat can't necessarily answer that question definitively without revealing sources and methods they want to protect. The organizations that have been compromised may not even know the full extent of what the attackers can do, because advanced persistent threat actors typically maintain a low profile, conducting reconnaissance and positioning without demonstrating disruptive capabilities unless absolutely necessary. This uncertainty is itself a strategic asset for the attackers. Defenders can't know exactly what they're facing. The presence in their networks is confirmed, but the full scope of the threat remains ambiguous. Do you shut down critical systems to rebuild them from the ground up, accepting massive disruption and cost in the hope of removing all traces of the intrusion? Or do you try to contain and monitor the threat while maintaining operations, accepting the risk that you might not find everything? Neither option is good. Both involve trade-offs between different kinds of risk. And the attackers, having already achieved persistent access, get to watch how defenders respond to the discovery, learning about defensive capabilities and strategies that will inform their future operations. The staying power of groups like Volt Typhoon comes from this patience and this willingness to operate at low tempo indefinitely. Traditional cybercriminals need to monetize their access relatively quickly. The longer they stay in a network without extracting value, the higher their risk of detection without compensation. But nation-state actors sponsored by governments, operating with strategic rather than financial objectives, can afford to wait. They can maintain access for years, collecting intelligence, updating their understanding of target systems, refining their capabilities, all while drawing regular salaries from their sponsoring governments. It's a fundamentally different threat model, and it doesn't map well to the security approaches developed primarily to counter financially motivated attacks. CISA's advisory on Volt Typhoon includes extensive technical details about the tools and techniques observed, the indicators of compromise that organizations can use to search their own networks for signs of similar intrusion, and the mitigations that can reduce vulnerability. But the advisory also includes something more subtle, a kind of resigned acknowledgement that complete removal may not be achievable. The recommendations focus on hardening systems, improving visibility, implementing strong authentication, and monitoring for suspicious activity. They're about limiting damage and improving the chances of detecting intrusion, not about guaranteeing that intrusion can't occur or persist. It's defensive advice for an environment where the baseline assumption is that adversaries are probably already present and complete security is likely impossible. This represents a significant shift in how government agencies frame the cyber threat. Earlier advisories often focused on specific vulnerabilities and specific attacks, creating the impression that if you patched the vulnerability and cleaned up the specific malware, you'd be secure. The more recent messaging about advanced persistent threats is more honest about the challenge defenders face. It acknowledges that these aren't problems that can be solved in the traditional sense. They're conditions that have to be managed, threats that have to be contained rather than eliminated, risks that have to be accepted and mitigated rather than removed completely. For the organizations that discover they've been compromised by something like Volt Typhoon, this creates an impossible dilemma. Do they disclose publicly that their systems have been breached, potentially panicking customers, inviting regulatory scrutiny, and damaging their reputation? Or do they handle it quietly, working with government agencies and security firms to try to understand and contain the threat while keeping it out of the headlines? There's no good answer. Public disclosure can harm the organization and potentially tip off the attackers about what's been discovered, causing them to change tactics or activate destructive capabilities before they can be fully mapped. But quiet handling means the public remains unaware of the risk, other potential targets don't benefit from the lessons learned, and the full scope of the problem stays hidden, which serves the attacker's interest in maintaining their invisibility. What we know about Volt Typhoon, as extensively as it's been documented by government agencies and security firms, is almost certainly only part of the story. The intrusions that have been discovered and analyzed represent the visible portion of the operation. How much remains hidden? How many other sectors or organizations have been compromised but haven't yet been identified? How many other groups are conducting similar operations with different targets or different techniques that haven't yet been discovered and publicly named? The nature of this kind of threat means that absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. Not knowing you're compromised doesn't mean you aren't. It might just mean the adversary is good enough at operational security that you haven't found them yet. And that's the deepest, most disturbing aspect of the Volt Typhoon story. It's not an aberration. It's a template. It's what successful modern nation-state cyber operations look like when they're conducted with discipline and strategic patience. It's the future of how adversaries will position themselves inside critical systems, waiting for possibilities that may or may not materialize, creating options for their governments that they hope never have to be exercised, but that fundamentally change strategic calculations simply by existing. The occupation isn't ending. It's probably expanding. And the defender's best hope isn't removing the adversary completely. It's making the occupation costly enough and risky enough that it degrades the value of whatever intelligence or positioning the adversary is achieving. It's a grim calculus, but it's the reality of invisible war. The ghosts are in the machine, and they're not leaving. If Volt Typhoon represents the long game of positioning for potential future disruption, Salt Typhoon represents something equally disturbing but more immediately concerning: a massive, ongoing compromise of the telecommunications infrastructure that carries everything from casual conversations to the most sensitive government communications, executed with such sophistication and such depth that U.S. government officials have stated, on record, that completely removing the threat actors from American telecommunications networks may not be possible. Let that sink in for a moment. The systems that route phone calls, carry text messages, enable internet connectivity, and provide the backbone for nearly all digital communication in the United States are compromised by a foreign adversary, and the government's assessment is that full remediation may be impossible. The scope of the Salt Typhoon campaign, as it became publicly known in late 2024, is breathtaking in its ambition and its execution. At least 8 major U.S. telecommunications providers were confirmed to be compromised, including industry giants like Verizon, AT&T, and T-Mobile. But the compromise wasn't limited to stealing customer data or conducting traditional espionage. The intruders, assessed by U.S. intelligence to be affiliated with Chinese state security, gained access to systems that telecommunications companies are legally required to maintain for lawful wiretapping purposes. Think about the implications of that for just a second. The very systems built to allow law enforcement, with appropriate court authorization, to monitor communications became a gateway for foreign intelligence to conduct their own surveillance, completely unmonitored and uncontrolled. The irony is so sharp it's almost painful. These lawful intercept systems exist because the U.S. government mandated, through the Communications Assistance for Law Enforcement Act passed in 1994, that telecommunications carriers build in capabilities that would allow court-authorized surveillance. The logic at the time was sound. As communications systems became increasingly digital and complex, law enforcement needed guaranteed ways to execute lawful wiretaps. But what CALIA created was centralized points of extraordinary sensitivity, systems that by their very nature have access to vast amounts of communication data and metadata. And those centralized points of sensitivity became high-value targets for exactly the kind of adversary that Salt Typhoon represents. According to officials familiar with the investigation, the Chinese actors accessed call records that showed who was communicating with whom, creating a map of communications patterns for potentially millions of Americans. But it went deeper than metadata. They accessed the actual content of communications for a smaller group of targets, primarily individuals in government and political positions. The reporting indicated that communications of senior U.S. government officials, including individuals associated with both major political campaigns in the 2024 presidential election, were among those accessed. This wasn't blanket collection of everyone's phone calls. It was targeted surveillance of specific individuals whose communications would have intelligence value, using the infrastructure and access methods that the telecommunications companies themselves had built for lawful intercept purposes. The technical sophistication of maintaining this level of access across multiple major carriers over what appears to have been an extended period demonstrates capabilities that go well beyond what people typically imagine when they think about hacking. Each telecommunications company has its own network architecture, its own security practices, its own systems and protocols. Compromising one carrier and maintaining persistent access is challenging enough. Doing it across at least 8 separate organizations, each presumably implementing security measures and conducting monitoring for anomalous activity, requires resources, discipline, and expertise at a level that only well-funded, well-organized nation-state operations can sustain. The specific techniques Salt Typhoon used are still being analyzed, and many details remain classified to protect ongoing investigations and potentially to avoid revealing defensive capabilities. But what's been made public suggests a systematic approach to understanding telecommunications infrastructure at a deep technical level and exploiting vulnerabilities in ways that provided maximum access with minimal detection. One approach that security researchers have identified in similar campaigns involves compromising routers and switches that form the backbone of telecommunications networks, embedding themselves at the infrastructure level rather than just in the servers and databases that carriers use for customer management and billing. When you compromise infrastructure at this level, you're not just breaking into a computer system. You're positioning yourself inside the actual paths that data takes as it moves through the network. Every phone call that gets routed through a compromised router can potentially be intercepted. Every text message passing through a compromised switch can be copied. The metadata about who's communicating with whom, when, and for how long is right there in the routing information that these systems process. And because this infrastructure handles enormous volumes of traffic as part of its normal function, additional collection activity blends into the noise of routine network operations. The staying power of this kind of intrusion comes from the sheer complexity of modern telecommunications networks. These aren't clean, purpose-built systems designed from the ground up with security as the primary concern. They're evolved ecosystems built up over decades through organic growth, technology upgrades, mergers and acquisitions, and the constant challenge of maintaining service continuity while implementing new capabilities. A major carrier's network might include equipment from dozens of different manufacturers, running different software versions, deployed in different time periods following different security standards. There are legacy systems that can't easily be replaced because too many other things depend on them. There are emergency patches layered on emergency patches. There are connections between networks that exist for business reasons or regulatory requirements, each connection representing a potential path for lateral movement. Finding and removing all traces of an advanced intrusion in this kind of environment is extraordinarily difficult even under the best circumstances. You'd need to examine every router, every switch, every server, every database, every application, every piece of firmware, looking for anomalies, backdoors, modified configurations, unauthorized accounts, or any of 1,000 other potential persistence mechanisms. And you'd need to do this while maintaining service to millions of customers who expect their phones and internet to work without interruption. The operational constraints are crushing. You can't just shut everything down and rebuild from scratch. People's lives depend on telecommunications for everything from emergency services to coordinating medical care to staying connected with loved ones. So what happens instead is a process of investigation, containment, and remediation that necessarily operates under constraints that favor the attacker. Defenders identify specific compromised systems and clean them. They implement additional monitoring and security controls. They patch known vulnerabilities and harden configurations. But they're doing all of this while the network continues operating, while new equipment continues being deployed, while mergers integrate new infrastructure, and while the fundamental architecture that made the intrusion possible in the first place remains largely unchanged. The defenders get better at detection. The attackers adapt their techniques. And the cat-and-mouse game continues within a framework where complete victory for the defenders is probably impossible. Senator Ron Wyden, who has been outspoken about telecommunications security issues, stated in late 2024 that Salt Typhoon actors had completely compromised the wiretap systems of multiple telecom companies. He characterized it as potentially the most significant intelligence breach in U.S. history. That's a stunning claim from a senator who sits on the Intelligence Committee and has access to classified briefings about the full scope of the intrusion. It suggests that what's been made public represents only the tip of what's actually known about Salt Typhoon's capabilities and the depth of the compromise. Government officials briefing on the incident acknowledged that while telecom companies were working to evict the intruders from their networks, the complexity of the task meant that complete removal couldn't be guaranteed. And Neuberger, the Deputy National Security Advisor for Cyber, stated that the government couldn't say with certainty whether the threat actors had been fully removed from U.S. telecommunications infrastructure. This is an extraordinary admission. In most cybersecurity incidents, even complex ones, organizations eventually reach a point where they can declare with reasonable confidence that the intruder has been removed and normal operations can resume. The fact that government officials, months into the investigation and remediation effort, couldn't make that claim about Salt Typhoon speaks to either the sophistication of the intrusion or the complexity of the environment, or more likely both. The strategic value of access to telecommunications infrastructure is difficult to overstate. Communications metadata, even without content, provides incredibly rich intelligence. You can map social networks, identify who influences whom, discover undisclosed relationships, track people's movements through cell tower connections, establish patterns of behavior, and identify anomalies that might indicate significant events or changes in plans. During the Cold War, intelligence agencies would have considered access to this kind of comprehensive communications data to be an intelligence coup of the highest order. Now imagine having not just metadata, but actual content access to the communications of government officials, military personnel, political figures, business leaders, journalists, and activists. The intelligence value compounds exponentially. But beyond intelligence collection, there's the potential for manipulation and disruption. An adversary with deep access to telecommunications infrastructure can do more than just listen. They could potentially modify routing, redirect communications, inject false messages, disrupt service to specific targets, or in extreme scenarios, degrade the overall reliability of communications infrastructure in ways that would complicate coordinated responses to crises. None of these capabilities have been publicly confirmed in the Salt Typhoon case, but the nature of the access that was achieved makes them theoretically possible, and theoretical possibilities become serious considerations in strategic planning. The challenge of securing telecommunications infrastructure against this level of threat has led to serious discussions about fundamental changes to how these systems are architected and regulated. Some security experts have called for eliminating or fundamentally restructuring the lawful intercept systems that became entry points for Salt Typhoon, arguing that the security risks they create outweigh their value for law enforcement. Others have proposed mandatory zero-trust architectures, encrypted communications as default, and much more rigorous security requirements for telecommunications equipment and software. But all of these proposals run into the same fundamental problem. They would be extraordinarily expensive to implement, would take years to fully deploy, and would require coordination across dozens of companies and thousands of networks. The telecommunications infrastructure we have is the infrastructure we're stuck with for the foreseeable future, which means the vulnerabilities that Salt Typhoon exploited are likely to remain exploitable, in one form or another, for years to come. The companies themselves face a terrible position. Acknowledging the full extent of compromise could trigger panic among customers, regulatory investigations, shareholder lawsuits, and competitive disadvantage as customers move to carriers perceived as more secure, even though the evidence suggests that all major carriers were affected. But downplaying the severity of the breach or prematurely declaring victory over the intruders creates different risks, potentially leaving customers exposed to ongoing surveillance without adequate warning. Most companies have issued carefully worded statements acknowledging that they were targeted, that they're working with authorities, and that they've implemented additional security measures. But they stop short of the kind of detailed disclosure that would allow customers to make truly informed decisions about their communications security. For ordinary Americans, the practical advice from security experts has been relatively limited and unsatisfying. Use encrypted messaging apps like Signal for sensitive communications. Be aware that phone calls and text messages may not be secure. Consider the possibility that communications metadata is being collected, but these recommendations don't address the fundamental problem. The infrastructure that virtually everyone depends on for connectivity has been compromised at a level that may be unrecoverable without reconstruction that's not economically or practically feasible. There's no opt-out from telecommunications infrastructure. Even if you personally use encrypted messaging, the metadata about who you're communicating with and when is still flowing through compromised infrastructure. Even if you minimize phone use, emergency services, banking, healthcare, and countless other essential services depend on the same networks. What makes the Salt Typhoon situation particularly frustrating is the predictability of it. Security researchers and civil liberties advocates had warned for years that lawful intercept systems would become targets for exactly this kind of intrusion. The NSA had advocated for telecommunications equipment to include security backdoors for government access, and security experts had responded that you can't create a backdoor that only good guys can use. Any intentional weakness in security architecture will eventually be discovered and exploited by adversaries. The Salt Typhoon compromise is, in many ways, a vindication of those warnings, but a vindication that provides no satisfaction because the damage is done and the vulnerability remains. The international dimension adds another layer of complexity. Salt Typhoon didn't just compromise U.S. telecommunications. Reporting suggests that similar operations may have occurred or are ongoing in other countries, targeting their telecommunications infrastructure with the same strategic objectives. This isn't just about American networks. It's about the global telecommunications infrastructure that connects the world, and the reality that nations with advanced cyber capabilities are exploiting that infrastructure for intelligence and positioning purposes in ways that traditional international frameworks have no mechanism to address or regulate. The Salt Typhoon campaign represents a new normal that nobody wants to fully acknowledge. The communications infrastructure that modern society depends on is persistently compromised by sophisticated adversaries. Complete removal of those adversaries may not be achievable with current technology and resources, and there's no clear path forward that would fundamentally change this situation in the near term. We're living in a world where the assumption that communications are potentially monitored by foreign intelligence has to be factored into how sensitive discussions are conducted, how security for high-value individuals is managed, and how government and businesses protect their most critical information. The telecommunications companies will continue working to improve security, implementing the latest technologies and practices. Government agencies will continue investigating, disrupting operations where possible, and issuing advisories about threats and mitigations. But the fundamental dynamic, the reality of persistent compromise in critical communications infrastructure, is likely to remain a feature of the landscape for the foreseeable future. Salt Typhoon may eventually be disrupted or degraded to the point where it's no longer effective. But the strategic imperative that motivated the operation remains, and other operations with different names but similar objectives are almost certainly already underway or in development. This is what invisible war looks like in the telecommunications domain. Not dramatic outages or obviously disrupted service, but quiet, persistent compromise that creates intelligence advantages and strategic options for adversaries, while remaining largely invisible to the public that depends on these networks every day. The occupation continues. The watchers remain in place, and the networks that connect our world remain compromised in ways that may prove impossible to fully remediate without rebuilding them from the ground up, a task that's economically and practically beyond what democratic societies have shown themselves willing to undertake. So we live with the ghosts in our telecommunications systems, hope that they're only watching and not preparing for more active operations, and try to adapt our security practices to a reality where absolute security in communications is probably no longer achievable. When discussing the invisible cyber wars being waged across global networks, Russian operations occupy a unique and particularly destabilizing position. Unlike the calculated, strategic patience of Chinese campaigns like Volt Typhoon and Salt Typhoon, Russian cyber operations blend state-sponsored espionage and sabotage with what appears to be loosely coordinated cybercriminal activity in ways that make attribution complicated and responses difficult. The line between Russian military intelligence, civilian intelligence services, and ostensibly independent criminal hacking groups is deliberately blurred, creating plausible deniability while enabling operations that serve state interests through channels that can be disavowed when convenient. The two most prominent and persistent threat actors associated with Russian operations are Sandworm and APT-28, though they're far from the only groups operating in this space. Sandworm, assessed to be a unit within Russia's military intelligence service known as the GRU, has been responsible for some of the most destructive cyber attacks ever documented. They were behind the 2015 and 2016 attacks on Ukraine's power grid that left hundreds of thousands without electricity. They developed and deployed NotPetya in 2017, malware that was initially targeted at Ukrainian organizations but spread globally, causing over $10 billion in damages to companies worldwide and earning the distinction of being one of the most destructive cyber attacks in history. More recently, they've been linked to ongoing operations targeting Ukrainian critical infrastructure, European government networks, and organizations supporting Ukraine in its defense against Russian invasion. APT-28, another GRU-affiliated group, operates with different tactics and different targets, but with similar strategic objectives. They've conducted extensive espionage operations against government agencies, military organizations, defense contractors, and political entities across Europe and North America. They were behind the 2016 breach of the Democratic National Committee's email systems, an operation that demonstrated how cyber capabilities could be weaponized for political interference in ways that fell short of traditional warfare, but achieved strategic effects nonetheless. They've targeted Olympic organizations, anti-doping agencies, and international investigators looking into Russian activities, showing a pattern of operations designed to undermine institutions that challenge Russian interests. What makes Russian operations particularly complex is the ecosystem of cybercriminal groups that operate with apparent freedom within Russian territory as long as they avoid targeting Russian organizations or interests. Groups like REvil, Conti, and Lockbit, operating some of the most prolific ransomware campaigns in recent years, have bases in Russia or Russian-allied territories and appear to operate with tacit government approval. Western law enforcement agencies have identified members of these groups, know their locations, and in many cases know their identities, but Russian authorities refuse to take action against them. The implicit arrangement appears to be that these criminal enterprises can operate freely as long as they avoid Russian targets and potentially provide services or access to Russian intelligence when requested. This creates a situation where distinguishing between state-sponsored operations and criminal enterprises becomes difficult and perhaps meaningless. When a ransomware attack hits critical infrastructure in a NATO country, is it purely criminal activity motivated by profit, or is there state direction or coordination? When the same group that conducts criminal ransomware operations is observed conducting reconnaissance that looks more like intelligence collection than preparation for ransom demands, what category does that activity fall into? The ambiguity appears to be deliberate, allowing Russia to benefit from operations that serve strategic interests while maintaining deniability about direct state involvement. The pattern of Russian cyber operations over the past several years shows consistent themes: probing of critical infrastructure, particularly energy systems, targeting of government and defense entities, focus on organizations involved in investigating or opposing Russian activities, and a willingness to deploy destructive capabilities that go beyond traditional espionage. The February 2022 invasion of Ukraine was accompanied by extensive cyber operations including distributed denial of service attacks, wiper malware designed to destroy data and systems, and attempts to compromise Ukrainian government and military communications. These cyber operations, while significant, didn't achieve the overwhelming effects that some analysts had predicted, possibly because Ukraine and its partners had prepared for such attacks based on Russia's previous operations. But the attempts demonstrated an integration of cyber capabilities into military operations in ways that provided a real-world test case for how nations might use these capabilities in actual warfare. What's particularly concerning about ongoing Russian operations is their persistence even in the face of international pressure, sanctions, and defensive improvements by targets. Sandworm operations against Ukrainian infrastructure continue. APT-28 campaigns targeting European government entities continue. New variants of destructive malware continue to be discovered and analyzed. The operations adapt to defenses, shift to new targets when old ones become too hardened, and maintain pressure across a broad front, that forces defenders to spread resources across many potential attack surfaces. It's a strategy of exhaustion, constantly probing, creating incidents that require response, and waiting for the moments when defenses gap or attention wanders. The techniques used by Russian groups show evolution and learning from previous operations. Early NotPetya spread uncontrollably, affecting systems far beyond the intended targets in Ukraine, causing damage to Russian companies and creating diplomatic backlash. More recent destructive malware has been more targeted and controlled, designed to affect specific systems while avoiding the kind of global spread that makes attribution obvious and international response more likely. The groups have gotten better at masking their infrastructure, using compromised systems in third countries to route their operations, and hiding their footprints in ways that make forensic analysis more difficult. But they've also demonstrated a willingness to be relatively brazen when they assess the benefits outweigh the risks. The SolarWinds compromise, discovered in December 2020 and attributed to the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service, or SVR, represented one of the most sophisticated supply chain attacks ever documented. By compromising SolarWinds' software development environment and inserting malicious code into legitimate software updates, the attackers gained access to approximately 18,000 organizations that installed the compromised updates, including multiple U.S. government agencies. The scope was breathtaking, the sophistication exceptional, and the stealth remarkable. The malware remained undetected for months, giving the attackers extensive time to identify the most valuable targets among the thousands they had access to and conduct focused collection against those high-priority entities. The discovery of SolarWinds led to significant incident response and hardening efforts, changes to how software supply chains are secured, and enhanced monitoring for similar attack patterns. But it didn't stop Russian operations. Different groups shifted to different techniques. New campaigns emerged targeting different vectors, and the fundamental pattern of persistent, patient intrusion operations continued. The cost to Russia in terms of international condemnation, sanctions, and defensive improvements by targets was real, but apparently not sufficient to change the strategic calculus that makes these operations worthwhile. One aspect of Russian cyber operations that receives less attention but is equally significant is the targeting of civil society organizations, journalists, and political opposition groups. These operations don't usually involve dramatic destructive attacks or massive data thefts. They're quieter, focused on surveillance, information collection, and occasionally intimidation. Understanding who's organizing opposition to government policies, who's communicating with international partners, who's investigating corruption or human rights abuses becomes valuable intelligence for a government that views independent civil society as a threat. And the cyber domain provides ways to conduct this surveillance that are less visible and more deniable than traditional human intelligence operations. The implications of Russian cyber operations extend beyond the direct targets. When critical infrastructure operators in Europe and North America know that Russian groups have demonstrated both capability and willingness to attack power grids, water systems, and other essential services, it creates a deterrent effect. Organizations invest in security, governments enhance cooperation on cyber defense, and the threat shapes policy decisions and resource allocation. But it also creates uncertainty and the potential for miscalculation. If a major infrastructure failure occurs, and there's any possibility it could be cyber-induced, how do you respond? How do you know whether it was an attack or a failure of aging systems? And if it was an attack, was it state-sponsored or criminal, intended as a one-time action or the opening move of something larger? The challenge of deterring Russian cyber operations has proven extremely difficult. Sanctions haven't stopped them. Public attribution and shaming hasn't stopped them. Defensive improvements make specific operations harder, but don't prevent new ones. Offensive cyber capabilities that Western nations possess and occasionally hint at don't appear to have changed Russian behavior in fundamental ways. The asymmetry is profound. The costs of conducting these operations for Russia are relatively low. The benefits in intelligence gained and strategic options created are significant, and the international consequences, while real, are manageable from the perspective of a government that has already accepted significant isolation from Western institutions. What emerges from analyzing the Russian threat landscape is a picture of permanent, multifaceted cyber operations that blend espionage, sabotage, criminal activity, and information warfare in ways that resist clean categorization. There's no clear endpoint, no condition under which these operations would cease. As long as Russia perceives itself as in strategic competition with the West, as long as cyber capabilities provide asymmetric advantages, and as long as the international community lacks effective mechanisms to impose costs that would change the calculus, the operations will continue. They'll adapt to defenses, shift to new targets, employ new techniques, but the fundamental pattern of persistent probing and opportunistic striking will remain. For organizations and nations facing this threat, the challenge is developing resilience in the absence of any possibility of complete security. You can't prevent Russian groups from targeting you if you're an attractive target. You can make intrusion harder, detection more likely, and the value extracted from successful intrusion lower, but you can't reduce your risk to zero. So security becomes about building systems that can tolerate some level of compromise without catastrophic effects, about monitoring for intrusions with the assumption that they're probably happening, and about having incident response capabilities that can contain and remediate breaches when they're discovered. It's grim, defensive, reactive posture, but it's the reality of facing adversaries who are willing to devote significant resources to persistent operations indefinitely. The Ukrainian experience provides perhaps the clearest view of what determined Russian cyber operations look like when unleashed without significant restraint. The country has faced more than a decade of continuous cyber operations, from the early distributed denial of service attacks in 2014 to the infrastructure attacks in 2015 and 2016, through the NotPetya malware in 2017, to the extensive cyber operations accompanying the 2022 invasion. Ukrainian networks, government systems, critical infrastructure, and defense organizations have been under relentless pressure, giving the country's cyber defenders experience that few others can match and providing lessons that inform defensive strategies globally. But even with this experience, with international support, with improved technologies and practiced incident response, Ukraine hasn't been able to stop Russian cyber operations. They've gotten better at detecting them, responding to them, and limiting their effects, but they haven't stopped them. The operations continue because the strategic imperative continues and the capabilities continue to evolve. This is the Russian contribution to the invisible cyber wars, relentless, adaptive, multifaceted operations that blur the line between state action and criminal activity, that combine espionage with occasional destructive attacks, that target everything from critical infrastructure to civil society organizations. There's no resolution on the horizon. There's only the ongoing conflict, the constant pressure, and the need for perpetual vigilance against threats that adapt faster than defenses can keep up. The watchers from Russia are in the networks, have been for years, and barring some fundamental shift in geopolitical alignment or cybersecurity technology, will remain there indefinitely. It's another front in the invisible war, another set of adversaries who've made persistence their primary weapon and patience their greatest asset. Among the nation-state actors conducting persistent cyber operations, North Korea occupies perhaps the strangest position. It's one of the poorest and most isolated countries on Earth, subject to extensive international sanctions, largely cut off from global commerce and finance. Yet it has developed cyber capabilities sophisticated enough to steal billions of dollars in cryptocurrency and conduct espionage operations against targets worldwide. The paradox is explained by necessity. For a regime that needs hard currency to fund weapons programs and maintain the loyalty of elites, but that has virtually no legitimate means of earning that currency due to sanctions, cyber operations become not just an intelligence tool, but an economic lifeline. The primary North Korean threat actor in the cyber domain is known as the Lazarus Group, though researchers have identified multiple subgroups and specialized units that likely operate under a unified structure within North Korea's Reconnaissance General Bureau. What makes Lazarus distinctive among nation-state actors is the blend of financially motivated operations alongside more traditional espionage and sabotage. They're equally comfortable conducting a multi-million-dollar cryptocurrency heist and infiltrating a defense contractor's network to steal weapons system designs. The same skills, the same infrastructure, the same operators shift between different types of targets based on regime priorities. The scale of North Korean cryptocurrency theft is staggering when you really examine the numbers. Blockchain analysis firm Chainalysis assessed that North Korean actors stole over $6 billion in cryptocurrency between 2017 and 2025, making them by far the most prolific state-sponsored cryptocurrency thieves. The methods have evolved dramatically over that time period. Early operations targeted cryptocurrency exchanges with relatively straightforward attacks, compromising exchange infrastructure and transferring funds to North Korean-controlled wallets. More recent operations have employed sophisticated supply chain compromises, social engineering campaigns, and complex money laundering schemes involving multiple jurisdictions and cryptocurrency mixing services to obscure the trail of stolen funds. One particularly brazen example was the 2022 theft of over $600 million from the Ronin network, a blockchain used for the play-to-earn game Axie Infinity. The attackers compromised validator nodes that authenticated transactions on the network, using that access to approve fraudulent transactions that drained funds to wallets under their control. The sophistication required to understand the technical architecture of a complex blockchain system, identify the specific validators to compromise, and execute the theft while avoiding detection until the funds had already moved through initial laundering steps demonstrates capabilities far beyond what stereotypes about North Korea would suggest. But cryptocurrency theft, as lucrative as it's proven to be, is only one aspect of North Korean cyber operations. The regime has also shown willingness to conduct destructive attacks when provoked or when they serve strategic messaging purposes. The 2014 attack on Sony Pictures, conducted in retaliation for the studio's production of a comedy film about assassinating Kim Jong-un, involved stealing and publicly releasing vast amounts of internal corporate data, deploying wiper malware that destroyed systems, and making threats that led to the temporary cancellation of the film's theatrical release. The operation achieved its intimidation objectives and demonstrated that North Korea was willing to conduct aggressive cyber attacks for reasons that went beyond financial gain or traditional espionage. More recently, North Korean operations have focused on what might be called economic espionage and IT worker infiltration schemes. Multiple cybersecurity firms and government agencies have documented campaigns where North Korean operators target defense contractors, aerospace companies, and technology firms to steal intellectual property related to weapons systems, satellites, and other technologies of interest to the regime's military and weapons programs. The stolen information likely supports domestic development programs, allowing North Korea to bypass research and development costs by simply stealing the results of other nations' investments in these technologies. The IT worker infiltration scheme represents an evolution in North Korean revenue generation through cyber means. Researchers discovered that North Korean individuals, using false identities and remote work arrangements, were obtaining employment as software developers, graphic designers, and IT workers for companies in the United States, Europe, and elsewhere. These workers would generate income that was funneled back to the regime, providing a steady revenue stream while also potentially providing access to corporate networks and intellectual property. The scheme exploited the remote work arrangements that became common during the pandemic, the global nature of IT talent recruitment, and the difficulty of verifying identities and locations in digital employment relationships. What makes these IT worker operations particularly insidious is the blend of legitimate work and malicious access. The workers often performed their assigned tasks competently, avoiding suspicion while they earned salaries that would be astronomical by North Korean standards. But the access to corporate networks, the ability to potentially exfiltrate code or data, and the possibility of installing backdoors or maintaining persistence created security risks that companies only began to fully appreciate when the scheme was exposed. How many such workers currently remain undetected? What access do they have? What data have they already stolen? The questions linger without clear answers. The technical sophistication of Lazarus operations has improved significantly over the years. Early operations were relatively crude by nation-state standards, relying on basic malware and straightforward attack chains. More recent campaigns employ custom tools, sophisticated social engineering, and deep understanding of target environments. One documented campaign involved creating elaborate fake cryptocurrency investment opportunities, complete with professional-looking websites and applications, to lure cryptocurrency investors and developers into downloading malicious software. The preparation for these operations was extensive, involving months of building credibility, establishing online presences, and crafting convincing lures. The patience and discipline demonstrated in these campaigns would be impressive in any context, more so given the resource constraints North Korea operates under. The challenge of defending against North Korean cyber operations is complicated by the regime's willingness to accept risks and burn infrastructure that other nation-states might try to preserve. When a Chinese or Russian operation is discovered and its infrastructure exposed, those nations typically have incentives to preserve the capability by keeping some aspects covert. North Korea, with less to lose and fewer alternative options, appears more willing to conduct operations even when detection seems likely, gambling that the payoff will justify the exposure. This creates a different threat profile, one where defenders can't necessarily count on adversaries behaving conservatively or prioritizing operational security over mission success. The cryptocurrency dimension of North Korean operations also creates unique challenges for law enforcement and security. Cryptocurrency was designed to be decentralized and resistant to control by governments or central authorities, features that serve legitimate purposes for many users, but that also make it extremely difficult to prevent or reverse thefts. When North Korean actors steal cryptocurrency and move it through mixing services and multiple wallets across different blockchains, tracing it becomes technically possible, but practically very difficult. Efforts to seize or freeze stolen cryptocurrency have had some success, but substantial amounts still make their way through the laundering process to destinations where North Korea can convert them to usable funds. International sanctions on North Korea theoretically prohibit providing financial services or resources to the regime, but cryptocurrency exchanges and services operating in jurisdictions with weak enforcement or in decentralized ways create gaps that North Korean money laundering operations exploit. The challenge is similar to other international enforcement problems. Global cooperation is required, but incentives for individual jurisdictions or companies to cooperate fully are often weak. An exchange that asks too many questions and implements strict controls might lose business to competitors that are less scrupulous. Jurisdictions that crack down too hard might see cryptocurrency businesses relocate to more permissive environments. So money laundering continues. North Korean operations continue generating revenue, and the cycle perpetuates. The ultimate purpose of these financially motivated cyber operations is to fund regime priorities, particularly weapons programs that require hard currency for materials and components that can't be produced domestically. United Nations reports have documented links between cryptocurrency thefts and North Korean weapons development, estimating that substantial portions of the stolen funds support missiles and nuclear programs. This creates a troubling dynamic where cyber operations in one domain, cryptocurrency theft, directly enable weapons development that threatens international peace and security in another domain. The invisible war in cyberspace funds very visible threats in the physical world. For the international community, developing effective responses to North Korean cyber operations has proven difficult. Sanctions already exist and appear to have limited effect on cyber operations since they're specifically designed to bypass sanctions. Diplomatic pressure has little leverage against a regime that's already maximally isolated. Defensive measures help individual organizations protect themselves, but don't address the systemic issues that allow these operations to succeed often enough to be worthwhile. Some security experts have advocated for more aggressive offensive cyber operations against North Korean capabilities, but the risks of escalation and the difficulty of affecting capabilities that operate from one of the most closed and isolated networks in the world make this approach complex and potentially risky. What may be most troubling about the North Korean cyber threat is its sustainability. The operations generate enough revenue to be self-funding and likely even profitable for the regime, creating a positive feedback loop where successful operations fund the training, infrastructure, and salaries for more operators who conduct more operations. Unlike some other nation-state cyber programs that represent significant ongoing investments with returns that are primarily strategic rather than financial, North Korean operations generate actual money that can be used for any regime priority. This makes them less likely to be scaled back or discontinued due to budget constraints or shifting priorities. They're features of the North Korean state apparatus that will likely persist as long as the current regime does. The operational tempo of North Korean cyber activities has remained high despite international attention and defensive improvements. New campaigns are documented regularly. New techniques are observed. New targets are identified. The impression is of continuous operations conducted by multiple teams working in parallel on different objectives, some financial, some intelligence-related, some potentially pre-positioning for future contingencies. It's invisible war conducted for mixed motives, where theft and espionage blend together in campaigns that serve both immediate financial needs and longer-term strategic objectives. For organizations that might be targets, the North Korean threat requires different considerations than other nation-state actors. If you're a cryptocurrency exchange or service, you're a potential target purely for financial reasons. If you're involved in defense, aerospace, or certain technologies, you're a target for espionage. If you employ remote workers in IT fields, you need verification processes to ensure you're not inadvertently employing North Korean operatives. The threat is multifaceted and requires security measures that address different attack vectors and different objectives simultaneously. The continuing evolution of North Korean cyber capabilities suggests that the regime views this domain as critical to its survival and success. The investment in developing and maintaining these capabilities, the integration of cyber operations into broader strategic planning, and the apparent high-level support for increasingly sophisticated operations all indicate that this isn't a temporary focus or opportunistic exploitation of targets of convenience. It's a core component of how North Korea interacts with the world, generates revenue, and pursues strategic objectives in an environment where traditional options are severely constrained by sanctions and isolation. So North Korea remains a persistent presence in the invisible cyber wars, motivated by necessity, enabled by cryptocurrency's characteristics, and unconstrained by the diplomatic considerations that might moderate other nations' cyber operations. The operations continue, the thefts accumulate, the intelligence is collected, and the regime adapts to whatever defenses are implemented. It's another front in the endless conflict, another set of adversaries who aren't going anywhere, another example of how the digital domain has become a permanent battlefield where traditional concepts of victory and defeat don't apply, and where the best defenders can hope for is to limit damage and increase costs for attackers who have every incentive to persist indefinitely. Iranian cyber operations represent yet another distinct approach to digital warfare, one characterized by a willingness to combine cyber intrusions with physical effects in ways that blur the traditional boundaries between digital and kinetic attacks. While Chinese operations focus on strategic positioning and espionage, Russian operations blend state and criminal activity, and North Korean operations prioritize revenue generation. Iranian campaigns often aim directly at creating real-world disruption and occasionally destruction, tied closely to the regime's regional objectives and responses to what it perceives as provocations or threats. The threat actors associated with Iranian operations are assessed to be affiliated with the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps or with intelligence services operating under their direction. Groups with names like APT-33, APT-34, and APT-35, along with others tracked under various naming conventions by different security firms, have conducted operations targeting critical infrastructure, government entities, defense organizations, and businesses across the Middle East, Europe, and North America. The targeting priorities reflect Iran's strategic interests and adversarial relationships, with particular focus on countries that oppose Iranian regional ambitions or support sanctions and pressure campaigns against the regime. What distinguishes Iranian operations from many other nation-state campaigns is the willingness to cross from reconnaissance and intelligence collection into destructive or disruptive attacks. The 2012 attack on Saudi Aramco deployed Shamoon malware that wiped data from approximately 30,000 computers, one of the most destructive cyber attacks against a private company at that time. A follow-on campaign in 2016 and 2017 deployed updated variants of the same malware against additional targets in Saudi Arabia and other Gulf states. These weren't espionage operations gone wrong, or ransomware pretending to be state-sponsored attacks. They were deliberate campaigns of digital destruction conducted for strategic messaging purposes during periods of heightened tension between Iran and Saudi Arabia. More concerning from an infrastructure security perspective have been Iranian operations that target industrial control systems with apparent intent to understand how to manipulate them. Multiple security firms have documented campaigns targeting water treatment facilities, oil and gas installations, power utilities, and other industrial environments. The techniques involved suggest more than just intelligence collection. The attackers were learning how supervisory control and data acquisition systems work, how programmable logic controllers can be modified, and what commands or modifications might create unsafe conditions or disrupt operations. One particularly troubling case involved intrusions into water treatment facilities in the United States in 2021 and 2022. Iranian actors compromised systems that controlled chemical treatment processes, potentially giving them the ability to manipulate water chemistry in ways that could make water unsafe or damage infrastructure. The intrusions were detected before any manipulation occurred, but the fact that attackers achieved the level of access required to interact with operational technology raised serious concerns about both the sophistication of the operations and the vulnerability of critical water infrastructure. The challenge with these operations is distinguishing between reconnaissance and positioning for potential future attacks. When Iranian actors compromise an industrial control system, are they conducting intelligence collection to understand capabilities and configurations, or are they pre-positioning for potential disruptive attacks if tensions escalate? The honest answer is probably both. Intelligence about how systems work and how they're secured is valuable in itself. But that same intelligence also enables destructive operations if the strategic calculus changes. So even operations that never proceed beyond reconnaissance create strategic effects by raising concerns about vulnerability and potentially influencing decisions by defenders and policymakers. Iranian operations have also demonstrated integration with physical attack capabilities in ways that are unusual among nation-state cyber actors. In some documented cases, cyber intrusions into facility networks appeared to be conducted in coordination with or in preparation for physical attacks or sabotage attempts. This combination of cyber and physical approaches creates multiplicative effects and complicates attribution and response. When a facility is attacked both digitally and physically, which is the primary attack vector? Were they coordinated or coincidental? The ambiguity itself serves Iranian strategic interests by creating uncertainty about capabilities and intentions. The techniques employed by Iranian groups have evolved over time from relatively basic to quite sophisticated. Early operations relied on distributed denial of service attacks and defacement of websites, visible but not particularly damaging forms of cyber aggression. More recent campaigns employ custom malware, sophisticated persistence mechanisms, and deep understanding of target environments. The learning curve has been steep, suggesting significant investment in developing capabilities and learning from both successes and failures in previous operations. One aspect of Iranian cyber operations that receives less attention than destructive attacks, but is equally significant, is the extensive surveillance and intelligence collection against dissidents, activists, and opposition groups. Iran has a long history of transnational repression, attempting to monitor and sometimes intimidate or harm individuals who oppose the regime even when those individuals are living outside Iran. Cyber capabilities provide new tools for this surveillance, allowing intelligence services to compromise devices, monitor communications, track locations, and collect information about networks of dissidents and their international contacts. These surveillance operations often employ social engineering tailored to Iranian expatriate and opposition communities, using fake personas, compromised legitimate accounts, and carefully crafted messages designed to appear to come from trusted sources. The operations can be remarkably persistent, with some targets reporting years of continuous attempts to compromise their devices or accounts. The psychological effects of this constant pressure, the knowledge that your communications might be monitored and your contacts might face consequences, serves regime interests even beyond the actual intelligence collected. The international response to Iranian cyber operations has varied depending on the nature of the attacks. Destructive attacks like Shamoon generated strong condemnation and some retaliatory measures, though attributing specific responses to specific incidents is difficult given the sensitive nature of offensive cyber operations. Intelligence collection and infrastructure probing generate warnings and advisories, but rarely result in visible consequences for Iran. The calculus appears to be that the benefits of conducting these operations, both in intelligence gained and capabilities demonstrated, outweigh the costs imposed by international community responses, which remain relatively limited. One of the challenges in countering Iranian cyber operations is the regime's apparent willingness to accept escalation risks that other nations might avoid. Iranian operations have been relatively brazen at times, conducting attacks that were clearly attributable even if the Iranian government maintained formal deniability. This suggests either confidence that escalation can be managed or a calculation that demonstrating capability and willingness to use it serves strategic purposes that outweigh escalation risks. For defenders and policymakers, this creates uncertainty about how Iranian actors might respond to provocations or perceived threats, making the calculus of deterrence particularly difficult. The technical infrastructure used by Iranian operations has shown patterns of evolution that reflect both learning and adaptation to defensive measures. Early operations used infrastructure that was relatively easy to attribute to Iranian sources. More recent campaigns employ compromised infrastructure in third countries, commercial VPN services, and other techniques to obscure origin and complicate attribution. The operational security has improved as the groups have gained experience and observed how security researchers and intelligence agencies analyze and attribute cyber operations. Iranian cyber capabilities are generally assessed as less sophisticated than Chinese or Russian capabilities, but more willing to be destructive than either. This creates a distinct threat profile where the attacks might be more detectable than the most advanced nation-state operations, but also potentially more damaging if they succeed. The combination of improving technical capabilities with demonstrated willingness to conduct destructive attacks makes Iran a concerning actor in critical infrastructure protection, particularly for organizations in sectors and regions that align with Iranian targeting priorities. The regional dimension of Iranian cyber operations is significant. Much of the activity is focused on adversaries in the Middle East, particularly Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Israel. Operations against U.S. and European targets often appear to be responses to specific events or policies, such as sanctions implementations or military actions. This pattern suggests that Iranian cyber operations, while persistent, are also reactive and tied to the broader geopolitical context of the region and Iran's place within it. Changes in that context, such as the ongoing regional realignments and conflicts, are likely to be reflected in Iranian cyber activity. For organizations assessing their risk from Iranian cyber operations, the key factors are typically geographic location, industry sector, and connection to issues of Iranian strategic interest. Energy infrastructure, particularly in the Gulf region, remains a high-priority target. Defense entities and organizations involved in implementing or enforcing sanctions face elevated risk. Israeli organizations across all sectors face persistent Iranian cyber threats as part of the broader adversarial relationship between those nations. U.S. critical infrastructure, particularly industrial control systems, has been targeted in what appears to be both intelligence collection and potential prepositioning for disruptive attacks. The future trajectory of Iranian cyber operations will likely be shaped by several factors: the evolution of sanctions and international pressure on Iran, the development of nuclear program negotiations and their outcomes, regional conflicts and alignments, and Iran's success in developing more advanced capabilities. If Iranian cyber actors continue the pattern of improving sophistication while maintaining willingness to conduct destructive operations, they represent a growing threat that could approach the capabilities of more established cyber powers while potentially being even less constrained by concerns about escalation or international norms. What Iranian operations contribute to the broader landscape of invisible cyber wars is a demonstration that these capabilities aren't just for espionage and positioning. They can be weapons that create real-world effects, that combine with physical attacks that target the systems controlling critical processes and infrastructure. The invisible war has very visible potential consequences when adversaries are willing to shift from watching and collecting to disrupting and destroying. And Iran has shown repeatedly that it's willing to make that shift when its strategic calculus indicates the benefits justify the risks. So Iranian actors remain present in networks, probing industrial control systems, collecting intelligence on dissidents, positioning capabilities that could be activated for disruption if tensions escalate beyond certain thresholds. The operations continue because the strategic imperatives continue, because the capabilities provide options that Iran otherwise lacks, and because the international response hasn't imposed costs sufficient to change the calculation. It's another dimension of the permanent conflict in cyberspace, another set of adversaries adapting and persisting, another front in the invisible war where victory isn't achievable and the best outcome is limiting damage and maintaining awareness of the threat landscape. Among all the techniques that make nation-state cyber operations so difficult to detect and remove, perhaps none is more effective or more troubling than what security professionals call living off the land. This approach, used extensively by groups like Volt Typhoon and others, involves using the legitimate tools and features built into operating systems and networks to conduct malicious activities. Rather than deploying custom malware that might be detected by antivirus software or trigger alerts, attackers use PowerShell scripts, Windows management instrumentation, command line utilities, and administrative tools that exist on every Windows network, conducting their operations with tools that are supposed to be there, being used for purposes that blend into normal network activity. The genius of this approach is its simplicity. Every enterprise network has administrators who use PowerShell to manage systems, run scripts to automate tasks, and employ various utilities to troubleshoot problems and configure settings. The security monitoring tools deployed to detect malicious activity are tuned to look for known bad signatures, suspicious files, or anomalous network connections. But when an attacker uses the exact same PowerShell commands that a legitimate administrator might use, executed from a compromised account that has legitimate credentials, over network protocols that are authorized and expected, the activity doesn't look malicious. It looks like work. It blends into the thousands of other administrative actions occurring across the network every day. To understand why living off the land is so effective, you need to understand the baseline problem that defenders face, distinguishing malicious activity from legitimate activity in environments where both use the same tools and techniques. Imagine you're monitoring a network that has hundreds of administrators managing thousands of systems. Every day, there are PowerShell scripts executing, remote management connections being established, accounts being used to access multiple systems, and administrative tools being run to configure settings and troubleshoot issues. Now imagine that somewhere in that sea of legitimate administrative activity, an adversary is using the same tools from a compromised account to move laterally through the network, enumerate systems, access sensitive data, and maintain persistence. How do you find them? The answer is that it's extraordinarily difficult, requiring either behavior-based analytics that can identify unusual patterns in tool usage, or human analysts with deep knowledge of what normal looks like in that specific environment who can investigate anomalies and determine whether they represent malicious activity or just unusual but legitimate work. Both approaches are resource-intensive, require expertise that's in short supply, and produce false positives that erode trust and waste investigation time. So many organizations simply don't have the visibility or analytical capability to consistently detect living off-the-land techniques, which is precisely why advanced threat actors use them so extensively. PowerShell is perhaps the most commonly abused tool in living off-the-land techniques. It's an extraordinarily powerful scripting environment built into Windows that can access virtually every aspect of the operating system, execute code in memory without touching disk, make network connections, access databases, modify configurations, and interact with other systems across the network. It's designed to give administrators powerful capabilities for managing Windows environments. Those exact same capabilities make it perfect for attackers. A PowerShell script that downloads and executes malware in memory without ever writing files to disk that antivirus could scan is functionally indistinguishable from a legitimate administrative script unless you examine what it's actually doing. Windows Management Instrumentation, another favorite tool of living off-the-land attackers, provides interfaces for querying and controlling Windows systems remotely. Administrators use it constantly for tasks like checking system configurations, monitoring performance, and executing management commands across multiple machines. Attackers use it for reconnaissance, identifying systems with valuable data, checking security configurations, and executing commands on compromised systems. Again, the tool is legitimate, the use is expected, and distinguishing malicious from legitimate usage requires careful analysis of exactly what queries are being run, against which systems, by which accounts, and whether those patterns fit the normal administrative behavior in that environment. Command line utilities like net.exe, mic.exe, and others that ship with Windows provide simple but powerful capabilities for network enumeration, user management, and system administration. A legitimate administrator uses net.exe to view shared network resources or add users to groups. An attacker uses the exact same commands to map the network and elevate privileges. The tool doesn't know or care about the intent. It executes the command and returns results. Whether those results inform legitimate administrative decisions or malicious reconnaissance is invisible to the system. The defender's challenge becomes even more difficult when you consider the timeline involved. Living off-the-land techniques allow adversaries to conduct operations over extended periods without deploying anything that would age poorly or become outdated. Custom malware has version numbers, compilation timestamps, and signatures that can date it and potentially link it to specific operations or actors. PowerShell scripts using built-in Windows commands don't age. They work the same way on systems deployed today as they did 5 years ago. An adversary who gains access and establishes persistence using only living off-the-land techniques can maintain that access for years without needing to update tools or risk exposure through outdated malware signatures. This approach also provides incredible flexibility. When defenders discover one technique or command being abused and implement monitoring specifically for that pattern, attackers simply shift to different built-in tools or different usage patterns. The defender is trying to block or monitor specific behaviors from an enormous library of possible behaviors, any of which might be legitimate in some context. The attacker only needs to find one approach that works and that isn't currently being monitored closely enough to trigger alerts. The asymmetry is crushing. Volt Typhoon's extensive use of these techniques demonstrates their effectiveness at the highest levels of sophistication. These aren't opportunistic criminals looking for quick wins. These are well-resourced, patient nation-state actors conducting strategic operations, and they've chosen living off-the-land techniques as their primary approach. That choice tells you everything you need to know about how effective this methodology is against even sophisticated defenders. If you can avoid deploying malware entirely, if you can conduct your entire operation using tools that are supposed to be there, doing things that need to be done, you massively reduce your risk of detection. The implications for network defense are profound. Traditional security models built around perimeter defense and malware detection become much less effective. You need to shift toward understanding what normal behavior looks like in your environment and detecting deviations from that normal, But that requires baselines, continuous monitoring, behavioral analytics, and skilled analysts who can distinguish unusual but legitimate from unusual and malicious. Most organizations don't have those capabilities at the level required to consistently catch sophisticated living-off-the-land techniques. Some security experts advocate for approaches like application whitelisting, where only approved applications can run, and PowerShell logging and analysis, where every PowerShell command is logged and reviewed for suspicious patterns. But implementing these approaches in large, complex environments is extraordinarily difficult. Legitimate use of PowerShell and other administrative tools is extensive and varied. The volume of logged activity can be overwhelming. The false positive rate for purely automated detection is often high enough that alerts get ignored, and sophisticated attackers can still find ways to blend their activities into legitimate patterns if they're patient and disciplined enough. The reality is that living off-the-land techniques have fundamentally changed the defender's challenge. You're no longer just looking for known bad software or connections to known malicious infrastructure. You're trying to find the moments when legitimate tools are being used for illegitimate purposes by adversaries who understand your environment well enough to mimic legitimate behavior. That's a problem that technology alone can't solve. It requires combining technical monitoring capabilities with human expertise, environmental knowledge, and the kind of labor-intensive analysis that doesn't scale well. So the invisible war continues being fought increasingly with invisible weapons. The attackers leave fewer and fewer distinctive signatures. They blend into the background noise of normal network activity. They use the system's own capabilities against themselves. And defenders scramble to develop new approaches to a problem that gets harder the more sophisticated the adversaries become. It's another dimension of the permanent conflict in cyberspace, another reason why complete security remains elusive, and another way that patient, sophisticated adversaries can maintain presence indefinitely if they're disciplined about their operational security. The land they're living off is the infrastructure we all depend on, and there's no way to remove those tools without breaking the very functionality that makes modern networks useful. We've created the perfect environment for invisible occupation, and now we're learning to live with the consequences. When government officials discuss cyber threats in public forums, they're performing a delicate balancing act. They need to warn organizations and the public about threats serious enough to require action and resource investment. They need to maintain credibility so that when they issue warnings, people take them seriously. But they also need to protect intelligence sources and methods that allow them to know what adversaries are doing, because revealing too much about what they know could compromise the very capabilities that let them monitor threats. This tension creates a strange situation where everyone knows there's a significant gap between what governments know about the invisible cyber wars and what they can or will say publicly. The intelligence community has capabilities for monitoring cyber operations that go well beyond what commercial security firms can achieve. They have access to network traffic at internet exchange points through programs whose existence is acknowledged but whose details remain classified. They conduct operations that place monitoring capabilities inside adversary infrastructure, allowing them to observe operations as they're being planned and executed. They analyze the full spectrum of signals intelligence that might reveal patterns of cyber activity even before attacks reach targets. They conduct human intelligence operations that provide context about adversaries' strategic objectives, organizational structures, and command relationships. All of this gives them visibility into cyber threats that's far more comprehensive than what any public advisory or attribution statement reveals. But this knowledge comes with restrictions. Sources and methods must be protected. If adversaries learn that a specific type of collection is detecting their operations, they'll adapt. If details about how attribution is accomplished become public, attack groups will modify their operational security to evade those specific techniques. If the full scope of what's known about an adversary's presence in critical infrastructure becomes public, it could trigger panic, economic disruption, or demands for military responses that policymakers might not consider proportional or wise. So intelligence agencies find themselves in the position of knowing that serious compromises exist, understanding the scope and depth of adversary presence, but being unable to share the full picture. This creates a frustrating situation for the organizations that are targeted. When CISA issues an advisory saying that Volt Typhoon has been in critical infrastructure networks for years, organizations reading that advisory can't know whether they're compromised or not based solely on public information. The technical indicators provided are useful but not comprehensive. The techniques described are those that have been observed and can be shared, not necessarily all the techniques being used. Organizations are left to conduct their own investigations with incomplete information, trying to find traces of intrusions that may have been designed specifically to avoid the kinds of detection that public guidance describes. The attribution process itself involves layers of analysis that rarely become fully public. Technical forensics provide indicators about the tools, infrastructure, and techniques used in an operation. Intelligence collection provides context about who has capabilities matching those observations, who has strategic objectives that align with the targeting, and potentially who has been observed planning or conducting operations. Geopolitical context helps narrow the pool of suspects based on who would benefit from the operation and who has relationships that would make the target logical. All of this gets synthesized into attribution assessments that are expressed publicly with varying degrees of confidence. When you see phrases like assessed to be associated with or attributed to actors affiliated with in government statements, that's careful language reflecting both the confidence level of the assessment and the limitations on what can be revealed about how that assessment was reached. A high-confidence attribution based on signals intelligence that directly observe the operation being planned by specific intelligence units can't be stated publicly in those terms without compromising collection capabilities. So it's phrased more carefully, providing enough detail to be credible, but not so much detail that adversaries can work backward to understand exactly what sources enabled the attribution. This intelligence dilemma extends to decisions about when to reveal that adversaries have compromised specific organizations or sectors. If intelligence agencies discover through classified means that an adversary has gained access to critical systems, they face a difficult choice. Warning the affected organization and the public serves the important purpose of enabling defenses and potentially limiting the adversary's strategic advantages. But it also reveals to the adversary that their operation has been detected, potentially causing them to activate destructive capabilities before they can be contained, or to shift to different techniques and targets that might be harder to monitor. The decision about when and how to reveal known compromises involves weighing these competing risks. In some documented cases, intelligence agencies have chosen to monitor adversary presence rather than immediately disclose and disrupt it, using the access to understand capabilities, intentions, and the broader scope of operations. This makes sense from an intelligence perspective. If you know an adversary is in a network, but they don't know, you can learn a great deal about their objectives, their techniques, and potentially their plans for other operations. But it creates uncomfortable situations where organizations may be compromised, where critical systems may be at risk, but where the decision has been made that the intelligence value of monitoring the situation outweighs the risks of allowing the compromise to continue. When such decisions eventually become public, they can erode trust in government warnings and advisories. Organizations wonder whether they're being told about threats in time to defend effectively, or whether they're only being warned after the intelligence value of monitoring has been extracted. There's no good resolution to this tension. Intelligence agencies have legitimate needs to protect sources and methods, and to collect information that serves broader national security interests. But the organizations that are ultimately responsible for defending their networks and their customers need timely, actionable information to do so effectively. These competing imperatives don't always align. The political dimension of attribution adds another layer of complexity. Formally attributing a cyber operation to another nation-state is a political act with diplomatic and potentially military implications. It can escalate tensions, trigger demands for responses, and create expectations of retaliation or punishment that policymakers might not want to fulfill. So sometimes, even when attribution is known with high confidence, formal public attribution is delayed or avoided entirely to preserve flexibility in how the situation is managed. The intelligence assessment might be shared through classified channels with key allies and partners, but public acknowledgement waits for a moment when the political calculus favors disclosure. There's also the challenge of international cooperation on cyber threats. Different nations have different capabilities, different risk tolerances, and different relationships with potential adversaries. Information sharing among the Five Eyes Intelligence Partnership and other allied groups enables broader understanding of threats than any single nation could achieve alone. But that cooperation requires that shared intelligence is protected, that sources and methods remain secured, and that decisions about public disclosure are coordinated. This creates situations where multiple governments might know about a specific threat, but where the timing and details of public warnings are negotiated to balance the various national interests involved. For the public and for most organizations, the practical effect is that they know they're not getting the full picture. They understand that government advisories and attribution statements represent what can be said publicly given various constraints, not necessarily everything that's known. They have to make decisions about security investments, incident response, and risk management based on incomplete information, aware that somewhere in classified channels more complete understanding exists but can't be shared. It's an uncomfortable position, but it's also the reality of how intelligence works in a domain where revealing too much about what you know can compromise your ability to continue knowing it. The frustration this creates is real and significant. Security professionals talk about the security clearance gap, where decisions about how to defend networks are being made by people who don't have access to the classified intelligence that might inform better decisions. Executives at critical infrastructure companies wonder whether they're being told about threats in time or whether they're finding out only after their networks have been used as intelligence collection platforms for months or years. The public sees headline after headline about cyber threats, but struggles to understand how serious the risks actually are versus how much is threat inflation or political messaging. There's no easy solution to the intelligence dilemma. As long as cyber operations are an active domain of intelligence collection and strategic competition, there will be information that can't be shared publicly without compromising capabilities. As long as attribution involves sensitive sources and methods, there will be gaps between what governments know and what they can say. The best that can be hoped for is that intelligence agencies continue working to declassify and share as much actionable information as possible while protecting truly critical sources, that they err on the side of warning even when it means revealing more than is comfortable, and that the affected organizations understand the constraints and work within them as best they can. But the fundamental tension remains, and it will continue shaping how the invisible cyber wars are discussed and understood for as long as those wars continue. When defenders finally discover that an advanced persistent threat has been present in their networks for months or years, they face a challenge that's closer to archaeology than to traditional incident response. They're not just cleaning up after an attack. They're excavating through layers of system logs, memory artifacts, configuration changes, and installed persistence mechanisms to understand the full scope of what the adversary did, what they accessed, what changes they made, and most importantly, whether they're actually gone or whether traces of their presence remain that could allow them to return. This process, sometimes called threat hunting or advanced forensics, but perhaps better understood as network archaeology, reveals just how difficult it is to achieve confidence that sophisticated adversaries have been fully removed from complex environments. The archaeological metaphor is apt because, like physical archaeology, the process involves carefully examining artifacts layers at a time, understanding chronology and context, reconstructing past events from fragmentary evidence, and accepting that complete understanding might be impossible because too much has been overwritten, deleted, or was never recorded in the first place. Modern networks generate enormous volumes of log data, but logs typically have retention periods measured in days or weeks, not months or years. If an adversary has been present for 5 years, as appears to be the case with Volt Typhoon in some environments, most of the evidence of how they initially gained access and what they did in the early stages of their campaign has been overwritten multiple times. What remains are the current persistence mechanisms, recent activity that's still captured in logs, and forensic artifacts in memory or on disk that haven't yet been overwritten. The hunt-forward operations that the U.S. Cyber Command and partnered agencies conduct exemplify this network archaeology at scale. These operations involve deploying forensic capabilities to partner nations' networks to search for indicators of compromise and adversary presence. The teams conducting these operations aren't waiting for intrusions to be reported. They're proactively searching through network traffic, system configurations, and forensic artifacts looking for the subtle signs that an advanced threat actor has established presence. What they're doing is essentially archaeological excavation through digital infrastructure, looking for the equivalent of pottery shards and foundation stones that indicate past habitation. What these operations consistently reveal is that adversaries who've maintained access for extended periods have typically established multiple redundant persistence mechanisms. If defenders find and remove one backdoor, others remain. If one set of compromised credentials is disabled, others still work. If one command and control channel is blocked, alternates are available. This redundancy is deliberately designed into sophisticated operations because advanced threat actors understand that eventual detection is likely. Their goal isn't to avoid ever being discovered. It's to avoid being completely removed even after discovery, maintaining enough access that they can re-establish full presence without having to repeat the difficult initial compromise. The complexity of modern networks makes complete forensic analysis extraordinarily difficult even under ideal circumstances. A typical enterprise might have thousands of servers, tens of thousands of workstations, hundreds of network devices, multiple cloud environments, connections to partner organizations, remote access systems, and operational technology networks controlling physical processes. Each of these components has its own logging capabilities, security configurations, and potential vulnerabilities. Conducting forensic analysis thorough enough to confidently state that no adversary presence remains requires examining all of these systems, understanding what normal looks like versus anomalous, and having the expertise to recognize sophisticated persistence mechanisms that are designed to look legitimate. The timeline problem compounds the difficulty. Systems get upgraded, replaced, or decommissioned during the period when an adversary might have been present. Those systems might have contained evidence of intrusion that's now simply gone because the hardware was repurposed or destroyed following standard procedures. Cloud infrastructure is even more challenging because it's often ephemeral by design. Virtual machines get spun up and down, containers are deployed and destroyed, configurations change dynamically. If an adversary established presence in a cloud environment 6 months ago, much of the evidence might no longer exist in any recoverable form. Legacy systems present particular challenges for network archaeology. Many organizations maintain old systems running outdated operating systems and applications because the systems support critical business functions and there's no easy migration path. These systems often have minimal logging, weak security, and limited forensic visibility. If an adversary has compromised these systems, detecting and analyzing that compromise with modern forensic tools can be difficult or impossible. You can't easily deploy endpoint detection and response software on a Windows server from 2003. You can't get detailed memory forensics from systems that don't support the required capabilities. So portions of the network become archaeological dead zones where understanding what happened requires indirect inference from other evidence. The adversary's operational security practices also dramatically affect what can be discovered through network archaeology. Groups like Volt Typhoon that extensively use living off-the-land techniques and legitimate administrative tools generate forensic artifacts that blend into normal system activity. Finding them requires understanding very specifically what normal looks like in that environment, and having the time and expertise to investigate anomalies that might be either sophisticated intrusion or just unusual but legitimate administrative work. The signal-to-noise ratio is terrible, and the adversary knows it. They're counting on the difficulty of distinguishing their activities from legitimate system use. The distributed nature of modern networks adds another layer of archaeological challenge. An adversary gaining access through one organization's compromised systems might use that access to reach connected partner organizations, suppliers, or customers. Tracing the lateral movement of an intrusion across organizational boundaries requires cooperation and information sharing that's often hindered by competitive relationships, legal concerns, and the simple reality that no organization wants to admit to partners that their security was compromised and used as a launchpad for additional attacks. So the full scope of an intrusion might span multiple organizations, but each organization only sees its own portion and might not know or be able to share information about the broader campaign. There's also the challenge of adversary anti-forensics. Sophisticated threat actors understand that their activities might eventually be investigated, and they take steps to complicate that investigation. They delete logs that might record their activities. They use tools that operate in memory without touching disk, leaving minimal forensic artifacts. They manipulate timestamps to make activities appear to have occurred at different times, confusing timeline reconstruction. They establish persistence mechanisms in locations that standard forensic tools might not examine. All of this is designed to make the archaeological excavation more difficult and less likely to reveal the full scope of compromise. When defenders do discover sophisticated adversary presence and attempt to remediate it, they face difficult decisions about how aggressive to be. The most thorough approach would be to assume everything is compromised and rebuild from known good backups or fresh installations. But that level of remediation is massively disruptive, potentially taking critical systems offline for extended periods, and still doesn't guarantee success, because backups themselves might contain evidence of compromise if the adversary had been present when the backups were created. The alternative is targeted remediation, removing known bad artifacts and hardening known vulnerable entry points, but accepting the risk that hidden persistence mechanisms might remain. Neither approach is ideal, and the decision often comes down to weighing business continuity needs against security concerns. The human factor in network archaeology is often underestimated. Finding sophisticated intrusions requires skilled analysts with deep knowledge of both network forensics and adversary tactics. These skills are in high demand and short supply. Many organizations simply don't have the internal expertise required for thorough network archaeology and must bring in external consultants, creating its own challenges around trust, information sharing, and the learning curve those external experts face in understanding the specific environment they're investigating. Even with skilled analysts, the investigation can take months, and there's rarely certainty at the end, only varying degrees of confidence that the worst has been found and remediated. The legal and regulatory dimensions of network archaeology add additional complications. When evidence of significant compromise is discovered, there may be obligations to report to regulators, notify affected parties, or preserve evidence for potential law enforcement investigations. These obligations can conflict with the desire to remediate quickly and restore normal operations. The evidence gathering required for legal proceedings often requires more rigorous chain of custody and documentation than would be needed for purely defensive purposes, slowing down the response and potentially leaving systems in compromised states longer than security considerations alone would dictate. International investigations become even more complex. When adversaries are operating from foreign jurisdictions where they're protected by their sponsoring governments, there's little prospect of criminal prosecution that would require the extensive evidence preservation and documentation that domestic cases might need. But organizations might still have regulatory obligations in multiple jurisdictions where they operate, each with different requirements and timelines. Navigating these competing requirements while simultaneously trying to understand and contain an active intrusion requires coordination that many organizations aren't structured to provide effectively. What emerges from understanding the challenge of network archaeology is an appreciation for why organizations and government agencies are often cautious about claiming that adversaries have been fully removed. The honest assessment in most cases is that known persistence mechanisms have been eliminated, known vulnerabilities have been patched, and monitoring has been enhanced to detect similar activity in the future. But that complete certainty about the absence of adversary presence is impossible to achieve. The archaeological excavation has found what it can find, but the possibility of undiscovered artifacts always remains. This reality is deeply unsettling for anyone who wants clean resolution to security incidents. We're accustomed to problems that can be solved, issues that can be resolved, and situations where you can achieve certainty about the state of your environment. But sophisticated adversary presence in complex networks doesn't work that way. The best outcome is high confidence that significant compromise has been addressed, coupled with enhanced monitoring to detect attempts at reestablishment. It's not satisfying, but it's the reality of network archaeology in the age of advanced persistent threats. You excavate as carefully and thoroughly as you can, you document what you find, you take the best remediation actions available given the constraints you face, and then you live with some level of uncertainty about whether you found everything. It's another dimension of the invisible war, another reason why victory isn't achievable in any traditional sense, and another example of how defenders have been forced to accept new norms that would have been unthinkable in earlier eras of cybersecurity. When a company discovers that an advanced persistent threat has been inside their networks for months or years, conducting reconnaissance, stealing data, or positioning for potential future disruption, they face a cascade of difficult decisions. At the center of many of these decisions is a cold economic calculus that weighs the costs of different responses against various potential outcomes. This calculus often leads to choices that prioritize business continuity and shareholder value over complete transparency, contributing to the invisibility of the ongoing cyber conflicts that this investigation has explored. The most immediate calculation involves whether to disclose the compromise publicly. Disclosure carries significant costs. Stock prices often drop when major security incidents are announced. sometimes dramatically if the scope of compromise is significant. Customer confidence can erode, particularly in sectors like telecommunications or financial services where trust and security is fundamental to the business model. Regulatory scrutiny increases, potentially leading to fines, consent decrees, and ongoing monitoring requirements that constrain business operations. Competitors may use the disclosure opportunistically to suggest their own security is superior, driving customer defections. Class action lawsuits from shareholders and customers become almost inevitable for publicly traded companies. Against these costs, the benefits of disclosure are less tangible. Transparency might enhance long-term trust with customers and stakeholders who appreciate honesty about challenges. Public disclosure might enable better collective defense as other organizations learn from the experience and harden their own systems against similar attacks. Regulatory requirements in many jurisdictions mandate disclosure of certain types of breaches, so compliance is achieved. But these benefits often feel abstract compared to the immediate, quantifiable costs. So companies calculate. If the compromise primarily involved reconnaissance and positioning rather than data theft that affected customers, perhaps disclosure isn't legally required and can be avoided. If remediation can be accomplished quietly with assistance from government agencies and security firms, perhaps the incident never needs to become public. If the adversary hasn't actually stolen or leaked data that would directly harm the company or its customers, perhaps the story can be that systems were targeted but not necessarily compromised, a distinction that might not survive careful scrutiny, but that avoids the worst implications. This economic calculus is particularly acute for telecommunications companies facing the kind of extensive compromise seen in the Salt Typhoon campaign. These companies operate in highly competitive markets where service outages, security failures, or customer data compromises can trigger massive customer defections. They also face extensive regulatory oversight and potential liability under various telecommunications and privacy laws. The economic incentive to minimize the apparent scope of compromise, to declare victory over intrusions before that victory is assured, and to avoid public disclosures that might not be legally mandated is overwhelming. But the economic calculus extends beyond immediate disclosure decisions. There's also the question of how much to invest in defending against and remediating sophisticated nation-state intrusions. The costs of truly comprehensive security are enormous. You need cutting-edge detection technologies, skilled security personnel who command high salaries in tight labor markets, consultants and contractors for specialized capabilities, and potentially disruptive system upgrades or replacements to eliminate legacy vulnerabilities. You need processes for continuous monitoring and analysis that scale to the size and complexity of modern networks. And even with all of this investment, you're unlikely to achieve complete security against determined nation-state adversaries. Companies calculate the return on these security investments against alternative uses for the resources. Security spending doesn't generate revenue directly. It's a cost center that reduces risk but doesn't create new business opportunities in most cases. The benefits are counterfactual and hard to measure. You're paying to avoid bad outcomes that might not occur even without the spending. In many cases, spending on growth, marketing, or product development can be shown to drive better shareholder returns than equivalent spending on security, at least until a major incident occurs. The insurance dimension adds another layer to the economic calculus. Cybersecurity insurance has become a major market, with companies paying premiums to transfer some of the financial risk of breaches to insurers. But insurance policies typically have exclusions for nation-state attacks, creating a challenging situation where the most sophisticated and potentially devastating intrusions are exactly the ones that aren't covered. Insurance companies have learned from expensive payouts in recent years and have tightened their underwriting standards, requiring better security practices as a condition of coverage and limiting their exposure to large-scale incidents. So companies can't simply buy their way out of the economic risks through insurance, at least not for the kind of advanced persistent threats that this investigation has focused on. The regulatory landscape creates its own economic considerations. Different jurisdictions have different requirements for breach notification, data protection, and security standards. A multinational company might face requirements in the US under various state laws and federal regulations, in the European Union under GDPR, in China under cybersecurity and data laws, and in numerous other jurisdictions with their own frameworks. Navigating this complex landscape requires significant legal and compliance resources, and mistakes can be expensive. The economic incentive is often to interpret requirements as narrowly as legally defensible, disclosing the minimum required rather than erring on the side of overdisclosure. There's also the challenge of competitive dynamics. If one company in a sector discloses a significant compromise and competitors don't, even if they've faced similar intrusions, the disclosing company is disadvantaged. Customers and investors might assume that the company that disclosed is uniquely vulnerable rather than uniquely transparent, especially if there's no sector-wide acknowledgement that everyone faces similar threats. This creates a kind of prisoner's dilemma, where companies might collectively be better off with universal transparency about the nation-state threats they all face. But each individual company has incentives to stay quiet if others are doing so. The timeline of disclosure decisions also reflects economic calculation. If a company must eventually disclose an incident, the timing matters enormously. Disclosure during earnings season might be delayed to avoid contaminating financial results and analyst reactions. Disclosure near major product launches or business development announcements might be avoided to prevent overshadowing positive news. The calculation becomes about managing the inevitable damage rather than whether damage will occur, finding the moment when disclosure does the least harm to business objectives. For critical infrastructure companies, there's an additional dimension to the economic calculus. They operate facilities that society depends on for essential services. A decision to take systems offline for thorough remediation of sophisticated intrusions could affect electricity, water, telecommunications, or transportation that millions of people rely on. The economic costs of service disruptions extend far beyond the company itself to entire communities and economies. So companies have to weigh the security benefits of aggressive remediation against the societal and economic costs of service disruptions, often leading to decisions to maintain operations while attempting less disruptive remediation approaches, even if those approaches leave more uncertainty about whether adversaries have been fully removed. Government agencies sometimes provide economic incentives for companies to cooperate with incident response and threat intelligence sharing. Programs that offer liability protection for companies that share information about security incidents, or that provide government resources to assist with remediation, are designed to overcome some of the economic disincentives to transparency. But these programs have limitations. They can't completely protect companies from market reactions, shareholder lawsuits, or competitive disadvantages. And they often require sharing information with government agencies that companies might prefer to keep private, creating a different set of risks and concerns. What all of this adds up to is an environment where the economic incentives often work against the kind of transparency that would give society a clear view of the scope and scale of ongoing nation-state cyber operations. Companies stay silent about persistent compromises because silence is economically rational in most cases, even if collective transparency might serve broader societal interests. This economic calculus is a major reason why these cyber conflicts remain largely invisible to the public despite affecting critical infrastructure and essential services. Breaking this pattern would require changes to the economic calculus itself. Stronger regulatory requirements with serious enforcement might shift incentives toward disclosure. Liability protection for companies that discover and report nation-state intrusions could reduce costs of transparency. Industry-wide disclosure frameworks that ensure no single company is disadvantaged by being transparent could address competitive dynamics. But implementing such changes faces political obstacles, resistance from industries that benefit from current ambiguity, and the simple difficulty of regulation in an area where technical complexity and rapidly evolving threats make prescriptive rules challenging to craft. So the economic calculus continues to favor quiet remediation, minimal disclosure, and acceptance of some level of persistent compromise as a cost of doing business in the digital age. It's another reason why the invisible wars stay invisible, why victories can't be declared, and why the conflict continues indefinitely beneath the surface of routine business operations and carefully worded security advisories. The ghosts stay in the machines because revealing them completely would be too expensive, too disruptive, and too damaging to business interests that often take precedence over complete transparency about the threats we all face. At the heart of understanding why these invisible cyber wars continue indefinitely without resolution is recognizing the fundamental asymmetry that defines cyber conflict. This isn't just about attackers needing only one way and while defenders must protect every possible entry point, though that asymmetry is real and significant. It's a deeper structural advantage that makes sustained defense extraordinarily difficult and complete victory for defenders essentially impossible given current technology and organizational capabilities. The attacker's temporal advantage is perhaps the most fundamental asymmetry. Attackers can take as long as they need to research targets, identify vulnerabilities, develop exploits, and plan operations. Time is a resource they can spend lavishly. Defenders, meanwhile, must maintain vigilance continuously. Every system must be monitored, every vulnerability must be patched, every log must be reviewed, every anomaly must be investigated. This creates an exhaustion dynamic where defenders are constantly responding to an ever-changing threat landscape, while attackers can focus their efforts on specific targets during windows that suit their operational needs. The economic asymmetry compounds this temporal advantage. Developing offensive cyber capabilities is relatively inexpensive compared to comprehensive defense. A small team of skilled operators can develop and execute sophisticated intrusions for a fraction of what it costs to defend a large enterprise network. The math is brutal. Defenders must invest in securing everything while attackers only need to find and exploit one vulnerability. Organizations spend millions or tens of millions annually on cybersecurity, but determined nation-state adversaries can still gain access because the defensive challenge is simply too large and too complex for available resources to address completely. There's also a knowledge asymmetry that favors attackers. When adversaries conduct reconnaissance against a target network, they're learning the specific configuration, the deployed security tools, the network architecture, the versions of software in use, and the practices of administrators. They gain detailed knowledge of the defender's environment that they can use to tailor attacks specifically to evade defenses. Defenders, meanwhile, often lack detailed knowledge of what normal looks like across their entire infrastructure. They might not know all the systems they need to protect, all the connections between systems, or all the legitimate administrative activities that should be occurring. This knowledge gap means attackers often understand the defender's environment better than the defenders themselves do. The innovation asymmetry is equally significant. Attackers can continuously innovate, developing new techniques, finding new vulnerabilities, and adapting to defenses. Each successful intrusion generates lessons that inform the next. Security researchers occasionally refer to this as the Red Queen race problem. Defenders are running as fast as they can just to stay in the same place, while attackers evolve their capabilities. Defensive technologies and practices are always playing catch-up to offensive innovations. By the time defenses are widely deployed against one technique, attackers have moved on to approaches that bypass those specific defenses. There's a psychological asymmetry as well. Attackers can afford to fail repeatedly. Each failed intrusion attempt teaches something, and they can simply try again with different approaches or different targets. Defenders can't afford many failures. One successful intrusion can compromise years of security investment. This creates risk-averse behavior among defenders that can actually work against security. Fear of service disruption might prevent aggressive remediation. Concern about false positives might lead to tuning security systems to miss real attacks. The psychological burden of knowing that any mistake could have serious consequences affects decision-making in ways that benefit attackers. The attribution asymmetry we've discussed elsewhere bears repeating here. Attackers can hide their identity, operate through proxy infrastructure, and create plausible deniability that makes responses difficult and consequences minimal. Defenders must operate openly from networks that are visible and often publicly documented. This creates an environment where attackers face minimal consequences for aggression, while defenders must justify every security measure to stakeholders who want evidence of the threat's reality and the measure's effectiveness. The burden of proof lies with defenders while attackers benefit from ambiguity. The complexity asymmetry is particularly relevant to living off-the-land techniques and other sophisticated approaches. Modern networks are extraordinarily complex, built up over years through organic growth, mergers, technology upgrades, and the addition of new capabilities. This complexity creates countless opportunities for exploitation and makes comprehensive security assessment nearly impossible. Attackers can exploit complexity through techniques that blend malicious activity into legitimate system functions. Defenders struggle with complexity that makes distinguishing malicious from normal activity extraordinarily difficult. There's also a strategic asymmetry around disclosure and information sharing. When defenders discover a vulnerability or a successful attack technique, there's pressure to share that information so others can defend against it. Bug bounty programs, coordinated disclosure processes, and threat intelligence sharing all depend on defenders being transparent about security issues. Attackers, meanwhile, hoard vulnerabilities and techniques, sharing them only within their organizations or allies. This creates a situation where the defensive community's knowledge becomes public while offensive capabilities remain secret, giving attackers continuous access to information about defensive measures they need to bypass. The regulatory and legal asymmetries also favor attackers. Defenders must comply with laws and regulations in every jurisdiction where they operate, constraining their response options and creating legal liabilities for security failures. Attackers, particularly those operating with nation-state sponsorship or protection, face minimal legal consequences for intrusions that would be crimes in any single jurisdiction. International law and norms around cyber operations remain underdeveloped, creating an environment where aggressive cyber operations are possible without clear frameworks for response or punishment. The organizational asymmetry shouldn't be overlooked either. Attack operations can be structured for agility, secrecy, and singular focus on successful intrusion. Defensive operations must operate within corporate structures, with competing budget priorities, stakeholder demands, and organizational politics that can hamstring effective security. The resources dedicated to an offensive campaign are focused entirely on that campaign's success. The resources available for defense must be spread across all security needs, all systems, and all potential threats, creating dilution that reduces effectiveness. Finally, there's the cognitive asymmetry of success metrics. Attackers win when they achieve access, steal information, or position for disruption. These are positive goals that can be clearly defined and measured. Defenders win by preventing attacks, maintaining system integrity, and ensuring nothing bad happens. All negative goals that are difficult to measure and impossible to prove conclusively. How do you demonstrate that your security prevented an attack versus that you simply weren't targeted? This makes defender success invisible while attacker success is concrete, affecting resource allocation and stakeholder support in ways that disadvantage defense. All of these asymmetries compound each other to create an environment where patient, sophisticated adversaries have almost inevitable advantages over even well-resourced defenders. This doesn't mean defense is hopeless. Effective security can raise costs for attackers, reduce the value they extract from successful intrusions, increase their operational risks, and create enough friction that some attacks fail or are abandoned. But it does mean that complete victory for defenders, the elimination of adversary presence, and the prevention of all future intrusions, is unrealistic given current technology and practices. Understanding these asymmetries is essential to understanding why the invisible cyber wars continue indefinitely. There's no solution on the horizon that would fundamentally alter the asymmetric advantages attackers enjoy. Incremental improvements in defensive technology and practice can shift the balance slightly, but the structural advantages that make offense effective and defense difficult are baked into the architecture of computer networks and the economics of cyber operations. This reality is uncomfortable, but accepting it is necessary for developing realistic security strategies that focus on resilience and damage limitation rather than illusory perfect security. The implication is that we're living with permanent conflict where defenders work to make intrusions costly enough and risky enough that attackers' strategic calculations change, but where complete prevention of sophisticated nation-state operations is probably impossible. It's warfare stretched across years and decades, where victory isn't achievable and the best outcomes are managing degradation and maintaining enough deterrence that the conflicts don't escalate beyond certain boundaries. The asymmetries ensure that the watching, the waiting, and the invisible occupation of networks will continue for the foreseeable future, a permanent feature of life in the digital age that we're still learning to accept and navigate. While much of this investigation has focused on sophisticated technical capabilities, zero-day exploits, living off-the-land techniques, complex persistence mechanisms, perhaps the most enduring vulnerability in any security system remains fundamentally human. Social engineering, the manipulation of people into taking actions or divulging information that compromises security, continues to be one of the most effective techniques available to adversaries. And when you combine social engineering with nation-state resources and strategic patience, you get operations that can maintain access to sensitive networks for years through the simple expedient of manipulating or recruiting the people who have legitimate access to those networks. The sophistication of modern social engineering operations conducted by nation-state actors bears little resemblance to the clumsy phishing attempts that fill spam folders. These are carefully researched, patiently executed campaigns that study targets over weeks or months before initial contact. Operators build detailed profiles of their targets using information from social media, professional networks, public records, and previous intelligence collection. They understand the target's job responsibilities, their professional interests, their personal relationships, their vulnerabilities, and pressure points. Armed with this knowledge, They craft approaches that feel legitimate, relevant, and trustworthy. The fake IT worker scheme documented in North Korean operations exemplifies how sophisticated these approaches have become. Rather than trying to trick existing employees into compromising security, these operations create entirely fabricated identities that get hired as legitimate remote workers. The false identities include convincing resumes with verifiable work histories, often using real identities of accomplices or unwitting third parties, professional references that check out, and technical capabilities that allow them to perform assigned work adequately enough to avoid suspicion. Once hired, these workers have legitimate access to corporate networks, source code repositories, internal communications, and intellectual property. Their access isn't the result of exploitation or intrusion. It's officially authorized. This approach is devastatingly effective because it bypasses virtually all technical security controls. Firewalls, intrusion detection systems, endpoint protection, and all the other security technologies designed to keep unauthorized users out are irrelevant when the adversary has been given legitimate credentials and authorized access. The only defenses are thorough identity verification during hiring and vigilant monitoring of employee behavior for signs of malicious intent, both difficult to implement effectively for remote workers operating from foreign jurisdictions where verification of credentials and backgrounds faces practical and legal obstacles. The long-term presence of such workers raises troubling questions about what they might have accomplished beyond their visible job responsibilities. Did they install backdoors for future access? Did they exfiltrate sensitive data or intellectual property? Did they compromise source code repositories with subtle vulnerabilities that could be exploited later? Most concerning, how many such workers remain undetected in positions where they continue to have access to sensitive systems and information? The organizations that have discovered these operations probably represent only a fraction of those affected. Traditional insider threats, where existing employees abuse their legitimate access for malicious purposes, represent another dimension of the human element that nation-state actors can exploit. While most insider threats involve employees motivated by financial gain, personal grievances, or ideological commitment, nation-state intelligence services have long experience recruiting insiders through various means. An approach might start with seemingly innocent contact through social media or professional networks from someone claiming shared interests or background. Over time, the relationship develops. Small favors are requested, and gradually the target becomes compromised through a combination of inducement and coercion. By the time they realize they're working for a foreign intelligence service, they're already implicated enough that extraction seems impossible. The telecommunications sector has been particularly vulnerable to insider threats given the sensitive nature of the access that employees in these organizations have. A single compromised employee with access to lawful intercept systems or network management infrastructure can enable collection or surveillance at scale without requiring any technical exploitation of vulnerabilities. Some documented cases have involved employees approached by foreign intelligence services and agreeing to provide access or information in exchange for money. The damage such insiders can enable is difficult to overstate, and detecting them before significant harm occurs is extraordinarily challenging. Supply chain attacks that target individuals represent another vector where the human element becomes crucial. Rather than compromising an organization directly, adversaries target individuals at suppliers or partners who have access to the ultimate target's networks. A contractor working on behalf of a government agency, a software developer at a company providing services to critical infrastructure operators, or a security consultant with access to multiple clients' networks. All of these become potential vectors for compromise. The relationship and trust that exists between organizations and their suppliers creates opportunities for exploitation that purely technical approaches might miss. The COVID-19 pandemic and the resulting shift to widespread remote work expanded the attack surface for these human-targeted operations significantly. When employees work from home, the boundaries between corporate and personal digital lives blur. Home networks generally have weaker security than enterprise networks. Family members might use devices that are also used for work. The social isolation of remote work might make employees more vulnerable to social engineering that offers seemingly friendly connection or professional networking. All of this creates opportunities that sophisticated adversaries have been quick to exploit. Social media platforms, professional networking sites, and public information sources provide adversaries with a wealth of information for targeting individuals. Every LinkedIn profile, every Facebook post, every tweet or public statement becomes data points that can inform social engineering campaigns. Information about job responsibilities, projects someone is working on, professional frustrations, personal interests, family situations, travel plans. All of this can be harvested and analyzed to craft highly targeted approaches. And because people often use the same usernames, email addresses, and passwords across multiple platforms, information compromised from one breach can sometimes provide access to other accounts, creating cascading effects. The trust relationships within organizations also create vulnerabilities. Employees generally trust communications that appear to come from colleagues, managers, or IT support. Adversaries who've gained limited access to corporate email or communication systems can leverage that access to send phishing messages that appear to come from trusted internal sources, dramatically increasing the likelihood of success. Someone receiving an email from their manager asking them to review a document or click a link will usually comply without suspicion. If that email is actually from an adversary who's compromised the manager's account or is spoofing their identity, the result is compromise of an additional account and potentially broader access. Defending against the human element requires a fundamentally different approach than defending against purely technical attacks. Technology has a role. Systems that verify email authenticity, training simulations that teach employees to recognize phishing, monitoring for anomalous behavior by authenticated users. But the core of defense against social engineering and insider threats is culture, awareness, and processes that make exploitation more difficult. Employees need to understand that they're targets, that friendly approaches from unknown individuals might not be what they seem, and that requests for sensitive information or unusual actions should be verified through independent channels. Organizations also need processes that limit the damage any single compromised individual can enable. Principle of least privilege, where employees only have access to the systems and data they need for their specific jobs, can limit what an insider or compromised account can access. Segregation of duties, where sensitive actions require multiple people to authorize, can prevent single points of failure. Monitoring and auditing of privileged activities can detect misuse of access, though this must be balanced against employee privacy concerns and the practical difficulty of reviewing vast amounts of log data for anomalies. The long-term nature of sophisticated social engineering campaigns and insider recruitment means that detection often comes late, if at all. By the time suspicious behavior is noticed or an insider's activity is flagged for investigation, months or years might have passed during which sensitive information was exfiltrated or access was maintained. And because these operations involve legitimate credentials being used from authorized locations in ways that might look unusual but aren't obviously malicious, distinguishing genuine security incidents from unusual but innocent behavior requires careful investigation by skilled analysts. What makes the human element so enduring as a vulnerability is that people are necessary for organizations to function. You can't eliminate human involvement in network operations, system administration, or sensitive data handling. Technical solutions might reduce some risks, but they can eliminate the reality that people will continue to be targeted because they represent one of the most reliable paths to the access and information that adversaries seek. As technical defenses improve and purely digital exploitation becomes more difficult, adversaries increasingly focus on the human element as the path of least resistance. So the invisible wars continue to have a very human dimension. Not just the operators conducting intrusions or the analysts trying to detect them, but the countless individuals who have access to networks and systems, who make decisions daily about whether to click links or open attachments, who trust or question requests for information, and who either maintain or compromise the security of the organizations they work for. This human dimension ensures that even perfect technical security, if such a thing were possible, wouldn't eliminate nation-state cyber threats. As long as people are involved, adversaries will find ways to exploit human vulnerabilities, maintaining the permanent conflict and the endless watching and waiting that define the current era of invisible digital warfare. Looking forward at how the invisible cyber wars might evolve, several emerging technologies and trends suggest that the challenges defenders face will intensify rather than diminish. The fundamental asymmetries that favor attackers aren't going to be resolved by new technologies. If anything, developments in artificial intelligence, quantum computing, supply chain complexity, and network architecture are likely to create new advantages for adversaries, while making comprehensive defense even more difficult than it already is. Artificial intelligence and machine learning are already being integrated into both offensive and defensive cyber operations, but the trajectory suggests attackers will benefit more from these technologies than defenders. On offense, AI enables automation of reconnaissance at scales that would be impossible for human operators. Machine learning systems can analyze vast amounts of public information to identify targets, understand network configurations, and find vulnerabilities much faster than traditional methods. They can generate convincing social engineering content, including deepfake videos and audio, that make impersonation more believable. They can adapt attack techniques in real time based on defender responses, creating adversarial AI that becomes increasingly difficult to counter. Defensive AI faces different challenges. Machine learning systems need training data that accurately represents both normal behavior and malicious activity. But sophisticated adversaries deliberately make their activities look normal, creating a data problem that's difficult to solve. Defensive AI systems also face the false positive challenge at scale. Flagging too many innocuous activities as suspicious creates alert fatigue that causes real threats to be missed. And adversaries are already developing techniques to evade or manipulate defensive AI, feeding it data designed to train it incorrectly or exploiting the system's decision-making processes in ways that cause misclassification of malicious activity as benign. Quantum computing represents both a potential defensive tool and an existential threat to current cryptographic security. When quantum computers reach sufficient scale and stability, they'll be capable of breaking the public key cryptography that currently protects most secure communications and data storage. Organizations and governments are working to develop quantum-resistant cryptographic algorithms, but the transition to these new standards will take years and will be incomplete. Legacy systems that can't be upgraded, archive data encrypted with current standards, and the simple difficulty of coordinating global transition to new cryptographic schemes all create windows of vulnerability. The offensive implications of quantum computing for nation-states are significant. Adversaries can collect encrypted communications and data now, store it, and wait for quantum computing capabilities to decrypt it in the future. This harvest now, decrypt later strategy means that any sensitive information encrypted with current standards is potentially compromised years before it might seem relevant. The diplomatic communications, military plans, trade secrets, and personal information being transmitted securely today might be revealed tomorrow by adversaries with quantum capabilities. The complexity and globalization of supply chains creates attack surfaces that are practically impossible to secure comprehensively. Modern technology products incorporate components from dozens of countries, assembled by different manufacturers, running software with dependencies on hundreds or thousands of libraries and frameworks. Each point in this supply chain represents a potential opportunity for compromise. Nation-state adversaries have demonstrated willingness and capability to target supply chains, inserting backdoors or vulnerabilities at various points that might not be discovered for years. The SolarWinds compromise showed how effective supply chain attacks can be, and there's no reason to think that was a unique case rather than an example of a broader class of operations. Defending supply chains requires verifying the integrity and security of every component, every manufacturer, every software dependency. An undertaking so vast that most organizations simply accept they can't do it comprehensively and instead focus on the most critical suppliers and most sensitive components. But adversaries only need to find one weakness in the chain to potentially compromise products at scale. And as supply chains become more complex and global, with increasing economic pressure to optimize for cost and efficiency rather than security, the vulnerability increases. The expansion of internet-connected devices through the Internet of Things continues to create billions of new potential attack surfaces. Many IoT devices are deployed with minimal security, weak or default credentials, limited ability to receive security updates, and integration into networks alongside more sensitive systems. Each smart home device, each connected industrial sensor, each networked security camera becomes a potential foothold for adversaries. And because these devices are often deployed and forgotten, receiving no ongoing security maintenance, they remain vulnerable indefinitely. The architectural evolution of networks toward cloud computing and software-defined infrastructure creates both opportunities and challenges for security. Cloud environments can enable better security through centralized management, consistent configuration, and rapid deployment of patches and updates. But they also create new risks through complex permission systems, shared responsibility models where security duties are divided between cloud providers and customers in ways that create gaps, and the reality that a single compromise of cloud credentials can provide access to vast resources and data that would have required compromising many separate systems in traditional architectures. The proliferation of operational technology and industrial control systems connected to internet-accessible networks expands the attack surface for adversaries interested in physical disruption effects. More facilities are adopting remote monitoring and management capabilities for operational efficiency, but each connection between OT networks and IT networks or the internet creates potential pathways for intrusion. The complexity of securing these environments is significant because many operational technology systems were designed decades ago without security in mind, run on specialized software that's difficult to patch, and have availability requirements that make standard security practices like regular reboots or updates extremely challenging to implement. The development of 5G and future telecommunications technologies promises higher bandwidth and lower latency, but also creates new vulnerabilities and attack surfaces. The complexity of 5G architecture, with its network slicing capabilities and software-defined networking components, provides more opportunities for sophisticated adversaries to establish presence and manipulate communications. The geopolitical tensions around 5G equipment vendors and concerns about embedded vulnerabilities or backdoors in telecommunications infrastructure reflect awareness that these systems will be attractive targets and potentially vectors for nation-state operations. Looking at these trends collectively, the trajectory is clear. The invisible cyber wars will continue and likely intensify. The attack surface is expanding faster than defensive capabilities can keep up. The asymmetric advantages that favor attackers aren't being eliminated by new technologies. They're being amplified. The number of nation-state actors with significant cyber capabilities continues to grow as more countries recognize the strategic value of these operations and invest in developing them. And the integration of cyber operations into broader strategic competition means that even if specific campaigns are disrupted, the underlying imperative to conduct these operations remains. Some optimistic scenarios suggest that international norms and agreements might eventually constrain the most destructive cyber operations, creating frameworks similar to those that limit chemical or biological weapons. But the prospects for such agreements face significant obstacles. The difficulty of verification in cyberspace makes treaties hard to enforce. The dual-use nature of cyber capabilities means that distinguishing defensive from offensive capabilities is often impossible. The economic and intelligence value of cyber operations makes nations reluctant to accept constraints that would require giving up capabilities that provide asymmetric advantages. And the lack of catastrophic cyber incidents that have caused mass casualties means there isn't the same imperative driving international cooperation that existed for nuclear or biological weapons. More likely, the future involves adaptation to permanent digital conflict. Organizations and governments will continue improving defenses, developing resilient strategies that assume some level of compromise is inevitable, and working to limit the damage adversaries can achieve rather than preventing all intrusions. The concept of assume breach will become more central to security architecture, designing systems that can function even when adversaries have some level of access, limiting what they can reach from any single compromise, and ensuring that critical functions can continue even in degraded states. Offensive cyber capabilities will likely become more normalized as aspects of national security strategy, with clearer doctrines about when and how they can be used, more integration with conventional military planning, and potentially more transparency about the general capabilities nations possess even if specific operations remain classified. This normalization might paradoxically reduce some risks by creating clearer expectations about responses and red lines, or it might escalate tensions by legitimizing operations that are currently conducted in legal and strategic gray zones. The private sector's role in this invisible warfare will likely continue evolving. Technology companies and cybersecurity firms are already deeply involved in detecting, analyzing, and sometimes disrupting nation-state operations. They provide infrastructure that's targeted, they develop defensive technologies, and they publish research that shapes understanding of threats. This role creates complicated dynamics as private companies navigate between serving customers across different nations, responding to government requests or requirements in various jurisdictions, and maintaining business relationships that might be affected by strong stances on attribution or threat disclosure. The human costs of perpetual invisible warfare are difficult to quantify, but real. Security professionals face burnout from the constant pressure of defending against adversaries who never stop. Organizations bear costs in resources, disruption, and lost productivity from both successful intrusions and the security measures implemented to prevent them. Society as a whole bears costs in lost privacy, reduced trust in digital systems, and the opportunity costs of resources spent on security rather than productive investments. And the individuals whose communications are monitored, whose identities are stolen, or whose livelihoods are affected by the economic disruptions caused by these operations bear personal costs that are rarely captured in aggregate analyses of the threat. Yet for all the challenges and costs, complete withdrawal from digital connectivity isn't viable for modern society. The benefits of connected systems, economic efficiency, communication capabilities, access to information, coordination at scale, have become foundational to how everything from healthcare to logistics to governance functions. We can't go back to disconnected systems and manual processes without accepting costs and limitations that would be catastrophic in their own right. So we're committed to living in an environment where invisible cyber warfare is a permanent condition, adapting our security approaches, our risk tolerance, and our expectations about privacy and security in ways that previous generations never had to consider. The invisible wars will continue because the fundamental conditions that enable them, the asymmetric advantages of attackers, the strategic value of cyber operations, the lack of effective international constraints, and the inexorable expansion of the digital attack surface, aren't going away. New technologies might shift some specific dynamics, but they're not going to fundamentally alter the equation that makes these operations attractive to nation-states and difficult for defenders to prevent. The future is more invisible warfare, not less. More sophisticated intrusions, not simpler. More persistent compromise, not clean resolution. It's an uncomfortable reality, but accepting it is necessary for developing the resilience and the strategic approaches that might allow society to function effectively despite ongoing digital conflict. The watchers will continue watching. The occupation of networks will continue expanding. The patient positioning for potential future disruptions will continue as nations prepare for contingencies they hope won't materialize but can't risk being unprepared for. And defenders will continue the exhausting work of trying to secure systems that can never be completely secured, detecting intrusions that are designed to be invisible, and remediating compromises while accepting that certainty about complete removal is probably impossible. It's the reality of the invisible wars, and it's the reality we'll be living with for the foreseeable future. Accepting the reality of invisible cyber warfare requires a fundamental shift in how we think about security, trust, and the relationship between technology and safety. The model of security that dominated earlier eras of computing, the idea that you could build walls high enough and make systems secure enough that adversaries could be kept out entirely, has proven inadequate against sophisticated, patient nation-state adversaries. What's emerging instead is a paradigm built around resilience, damage limitation, and acceptance that some level of adversary presence is the price of connectivity in the modern world. This shift starts with the concept of assume breach, a philosophy that's moving from cybersecurity specialty discussions to mainstream organizational security planning. Rather than building security strategies around preventing all intrusions, assume breach approaches start from the premise that adversaries probably already have some access to your environment. The question isn't whether you're compromised, but how badly, what they can reach from their current position, and how you can limit the damage they can do even with the access they've achieved. It's a darker, more pessimistic starting point, but it's also more realistic for organizations facing persistent sophisticated threats. Zero-trust architectures represent the technical implementation of assume breach thinking. Instead of trusting users and systems inside the network perimeter and focusing security at the boundary, Zero Trust assumes that any user or system could be compromised and requires continuous verification and authentication for every interaction. Devices requesting access to resources must prove they're in a known good state. Users must authenticate not just once at login, but repeatedly for different resource access. Network traffic is inspected and validated even when it's between internal systems. It's exhausting and complicated to implement, but it limits what adversaries can accomplish from any single compromise point. The concept of security resilience rather than security perfection is becoming more central to planning. Resilient systems can tolerate some level of compromise without catastrophic effects. They can detect intrusions that do occur. They can limit lateral movement so that one compromised system doesn't give access to everything. They can recover from incidents without requiring complete reconstruction. Building resilience requires accepting that you won't prevent all attacks and instead focusing on limiting damage and maintaining critical functions even in degraded states. Organizations are also having to recalibrate their risk tolerance and their definitions of acceptable security. The old model suggested that discovering a significant breach meant you'd failed at security. The new understanding is that discovering a breach might actually indicate good security. You had enough visibility and capability to find sophisticated intrusions that many organizations miss entirely. The failure isn't being targeted or even being initially compromised. The failure is not detecting the compromise in reasonable time, not containing it effectively, or not remediating it as thoroughly as practically possible. This recalibration requires different conversations with stakeholders and different metrics for security success. Executives and boards need to understand that security spending isn't wasteful if intrusions still occur. It's necessary to detect those intrusions, limit their effects, and maintain operations despite adversary activities. Regulatory frameworks need to evolve beyond simple breach disclosure requirements to recognize the complexities of persistent, sophisticated intrusions where complete certainty about compromise scope isn't achievable. Insurance models need to account for nation-state risks that current policies often exclude, but that represent significant potential costs. The psychological adaptation to living with ghosts and systems is challenging. There's something deeply unsettling about knowing that adversaries might be watching, that communications might be monitored, that systems might harbor persistent threats that haven't been discovered yet. For individuals, this can lead to fatalism or paranoia. For organizations, it can create decision paralysis or alternatively a reckless acceptance that security doesn't matter since perfect security is impossible. Neither extreme is healthy or productive. What seems to work better is clear-eyed acceptance combined with practical action. Yes, sophisticated adversaries can probably access your systems if they prioritize your organization as a target and invest sufficient resources. No, you can't prevent that with absolute certainty. But you can implement security practices that make intrusion harder, detection more likely, and damage more limited. You can make the cost-benefit calculation for adversaries less favorable by forcing them to spend more resources for less return. You can ensure that the most sensitive information and critical systems have additional protection beyond perimeter defenses. And you can plan for the possibility of compromise so that it doesn't cause catastrophic effects even if it occurs. The social dimension of living with persistent cyber threats involves broader conversations about privacy, surveillance, and trust in digital systems. When telecommunications infrastructure is compromised by foreign intelligence, what does that mean for the privacy of communications? When critical infrastructure has persistent nation-state presence, what does that mean for the reliability of essential services? These aren't just technical questions. They're questions about the social contract in digital age and what security guarantees, if any, individuals and organizations can reasonably expect from the technology they depend on. Some argue for fundamental architectural changes to how the internet and digital systems work, moving toward designs that prioritize security and verification over the flexibility and interoperability that have characterized digital evolution. But such changes would be enormously disruptive, would take decades to implement even if there was consensus about the right approaches, and might not ultimately solve the problem since adversaries would adapt to whatever new architectures emerged. The installed base of existing systems, the investment in current architectures, and the difficulty of coordinating global changes all suggest that fundamental transformation is unlikely, at least in any time frame that addresses current threats. More realistic are incremental improvements layered on existing systems. Better authentication mechanisms, more encryption, improved logging and monitoring, automated threat detection, regular security assessments. All of these help without requiring wholesale replacement of digital infrastructure. The improvements don't eliminate sophisticated nation-state threats, but they raise costs and increase risks for adversaries, potentially changing their calculus about which targets are worth the investment and which techniques are worth the operational security risks. The role of government in managing this new normal remains contested and complex. Governments have legitimate needs to conduct cyber operations for intelligence and national security purposes, but those same operations create vulnerabilities and techniques that can be used against their own citizens and critical infrastructure. The surveillance capabilities developed for counterterrorism or counterintelligence can be, and sometimes are used for purposes that raise civil liberties concerns. The offensive cyber capabilities developed for national defense can undermine broader cybersecurity if they involve hoarding vulnerabilities rather than fixing them, or if they set precedents that legitimize similar operations by adversaries. Finding the right balance between security, privacy, and operational flexibility is an ongoing challenge that different societies are addressing in different ways based on their values and threat environments. There's no universal answer, but the discussions themselves are important for ensuring that responses to the invisible cyber wars don't create other harms that might exceed the threats they're designed to address. For the future, living with ghosts in our digital systems means accepting ongoing tension between connectivity and security, between privacy and surveillance, between the benefits of digital transformation and the risks it creates. It means security becoming a larger part of organizational budgets and individual consideration than previous generations had to accept. It means constant vigilance, continuous adaptation, and the exhausting reality that the conflict never ends, that the defenders never get to declare victory and relax, that the invisible occupation of networks is a permanent condition of digital life. But it also means learning to function effectively despite these challenges. Organizations that accept the reality of persistent threats and build accordingly can maintain operations, protect their most critical assets, and limit damage even when incidents occur. Individuals who understand the risks can make informed decisions about what they share, how they communicate, and what trust they place in digital systems. Societies that grapple honestly with these challenges can develop frameworks that balance security needs against other values and create resilience at a systemic level. The ghosts are in the machine. They've been there for years in many cases. They'll likely remain there for years to come. Complete exorcism isn't on the horizon, but we can learn to live with this reality, to function despite it, and to limit the power these ghosts have to disrupt our lives, our economies, and our societies. It's not the future anyone would have chosen, but it's the future we have. The invisible wars continue, the watchers remain in place, and we adapt to a digital world where persistent compromise is the price of connection, where perfect security is impossible, but where resilience and careful planning can still allow us to use these powerful technologies effectively while managing the risks they inevitably bring. We've traveled through a landscape of invisible warfare, examining campaigns that have persisted for years, techniques that make intrusions nearly undetectable, and strategic objectives that have turned critical infrastructure into contested digital territory. What emerges from this examination is a picture fundamentally different from how most people conceive of cybersecurity threats. This isn't about ransomware criminals or data breaches that make headlines and then fade. This is about permanent, strategic positioning by nation-states who are playing an infinite game where the objective isn't to win decisively, but to never lose access, to always maintain the capability to watch, to collect, and potentially to disrupt. Volt Typhoon's 5-year occupation of critical infrastructure networks demonstrated that patient, methodical adversaries using living off-the-land techniques can establish and maintain presence in systems that control essential services. Salt Typhoon's compromise of telecommunications infrastructure showed that even the most security-conscious sectors face intrusions that might never be completely remediated. Russian operations blend state sponsorship with criminal activity in ways that make attribution complicated and responses difficult. North Korean campaigns fund weapons programs through cryptocurrency theft while simultaneously conducting espionage and deploying fake IT workers into foreign companies. Iranian operations demonstrate willingness to cross from digital intrusion to physical disruption, blurring boundaries that traditional security frameworks depend on. All of these campaigns share common characteristics. They're patient, they're persistent, they adapt to defenses, they exploit both technical vulnerabilities and human factors, and they continue indefinitely because the strategic value they provide to their sponsoring nations outweighs the costs and risks of conducting them. The asymmetries that favor attackers ensure that even sophisticated defenders with significant resources struggle to prevent intrusions by determined nation-state adversaries. The complexity of modern networks guarantees that some vulnerabilities will always exist. The economic calculus that companies face creates incentives for quiet remediation rather than public transparency. And the intelligence dilemma means governments often know more than they can say about the threats we all face. For individuals, the implications are both abstract and immediate. The critical infrastructure you depend on, power, water, communications, healthcare, transportation, has persistent nation-state presence in many cases. The telecommunications networks carrying your calls and messages have been compromised at levels that may prevent complete removal of adversaries. The supply chains producing the technology you use might have been manipulated to include backdoors or vulnerabilities. The companies you trust with your data face threats they might not fully disclose. This creates an environment where digital privacy and security are more aspirational than actual, where trust in technology requires accepting some level of risk, and where the invisible conflicts being waged affect everyone even though most people aren't aware they're happening. For organizations, the challenge is building security programs that accept the reality of persistent, sophisticated threats while maintaining operational effectiveness. This means shifting from prevention-focused strategies that can't succeed against determined nation-state adversaries to resilience-focused approaches that limit damage and maintain critical functions even when compromise occurs. It means implementing zero-trust architectures, improving visibility into what's happening on networks, developing capabilities to hunt for sophisticated intrusions, and planning for incidents on the assumption they will occur rather than hoping they won't. It means having uncomfortable conversations with stakeholders about realistic security expectations and appropriate risk tolerance. For governments, the invisible cyber wars create policy challenges that traditional frameworks aren't equipped to address. How do you deter adversaries when attribution is difficult and the threshold for what constitutes an act of war in cyberspace remains undefined? How do you protect critical infrastructure when the organizations operating that infrastructure are private companies with competing priorities? How do you balance the legitimate intelligence needs that drive your own cyber operations against the vulnerabilities those operations might create or the precedents they set for adversaries? How do you develop international norms and agreements in an area where verification is nearly impossible and where the benefits of conducting operations are so significant? The future trajectory is more conflict, not less. The technologies emerging, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, Internet of Things proliferation, 5G networks, create new attack surfaces faster than defensive capabilities can mature. The number of nation-states with significant cyber capabilities continues to grow. The strategic value of cyber operations for intelligence, positioning, and potential disruption ensures continued investment. In the absence of catastrophic incidents that might drive international cooperation means the current environment of persistent low-intensity digital conflict is likely to continue indefinitely. This doesn't mean the situation is hopeless. Effective security can raise costs for adversaries, limit the value they extract from successful intrusions, and create resilience that reduces the strategic effects they can achieve. International cooperation on cybersecurity, while difficult, does occur and does provide benefits. Technologies and practices do improve over time. Organizations that take security seriously and invest appropriately can meaningfully reduce their risk even if they can't eliminate it entirely. The invisible wars create challenges, but they don't make effective operation impossible. What's required is realistic assessment of threats and capabilities, honest acknowledgement of what security can and can't achieve against sophisticated adversaries, and willingness to invest in resilience and response rather than just prevention. It requires accepting some level of persistent compromise as the price of connectivity while working to limit what adversaries can accomplish with the access they achieve. It requires transparency about the challenges we face, even when that transparency is uncomfortable or economically costly, because collective understanding and response is more effective than every organization trying to address sophisticated nation-state threats in isolation. The invisible wars aren't going to end with peace treaties or decisive victories. They're permanent features of the digital landscape, evolving and adapting, but persisting as long as nations see strategic value in conducting cyber operations and as long as digital systems have vulnerabilities that can be exploited. The watchers in the networks aren't leaving. The patient adversaries who've established access to critical systems will maintain that access as long as they can. The campaigns that have been ongoing for years will continue for more years, adapting to whatever defensive improvements are implemented. Living in this reality requires us to be clear-eyed about the threats while not becoming paralyzed by them. Yes, nation-state adversaries have probably compromised significant portions of critical infrastructure. Yes, the telecommunications networks you use have had serious intrusions that might not be completely remediated. Yes, some level of foreign intelligence presence in sensitive networks is likely permanent given current defensive capabilities and network architectures. But we can still use these systems, still benefit from connectivity, still conduct sensitive communications and operations, if we do so with appropriate understanding of the risks and appropriate measures to limit exposure of the most sensitive information and critical operations. The story I've told over the course of this investigation is one without clean resolution, without heroes defeating villains, without the satisfaction of problems solved and threats eliminated. It's a story of ongoing conflict in digital shadows, of patient adversaries who measure success in access maintained rather than battles won, of defenders who can never relax because the attackers never stop, and of a global society increasingly dependent on digital systems that harbor ghosts we can't fully exorcise. It's uncomfortable and unsettling, but it's true. And understanding this truth is the first step toward developing the resilience, the strategic approaches, and the realistic expectations that might allow us to navigate this invisible war more effectively. So that's where we are. Living in a digital world where persistent nation-state presence in our networks is not an anomaly, but a norm. Where critical systems that our lives depend on host adversaries who are watching, waiting, and preparing for possibilities we hope won't materialize. where the conflict continues without end, without victories, with only the ongoing challenge of maintaining enough security and resilience that the invisible occupation doesn't escalate into visible destruction. The wars nobody admits are happening continue every day, in servers and routers and control systems scattered across the globe, waged by operators who go to work each day to conduct reconnaissance, maintain access, and position capabilities for whatever their governments might eventually require. If you've made it this far through this investigation, you now know more about these invisible conflicts than most people ever will. You understand the scope, the techniques, the persistence, and the challenge of defending against adversaries who have every advantage and infinite patience. What you do with that understanding is up to you. Maybe you make different decisions about what you trust to digital systems. Maybe you advocate for better security in organizations you're part of. Maybe you demand more transparency from companies and governments about the threats we face. Or maybe you just carry on with slightly more awareness of the invisible battlefield surrounding us. But however you respond, remember this: the ghosts are there. The watchers are present. The invisible wars continue. And understanding that reality, uncomfortable as it is better than living in oblivion while adversaries position themselves in our critical systems, waiting for possibilities that may or may not come, but that fundamentally change strategic calculations simply by existing. If you found this investigation valuable, if you think more people should understand these invisible conflicts, I'd appreciate it if you'd hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. These deep dives into the hidden aspects of cybersecurity and digital warfare take enormous research and time to produce. Your support through likes, subscriptions, and sharing helps make more of this content possible. And if there are other aspects of the invisible cyber wars you think deserve investigation, or other topics in this space that interest you, leave comments and let me know. The digital battlefields are vast, the conflicts are complex, and there's always more to uncover about the wars nobody admits are happening. Until next time, stay skeptical, stay informed, and understand that in the digital age, invisible doesn't mean unimportant. Sometimes the conflicts that nobody sees or talks about are the ones that matter most. The invisible wars continue, with or without public awareness. The question is whether we'll face them with understanding and preparation, or remain oblivious until the waiting adversaries decide the time has come to activate capabilities they've spent years patiently positioning. I know which approach I prefer. I hope after this investigation, you do too. Thanks for watching.